Hello, my friends. Before we start, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Whether it's about the story, the editing, or anything else, I'd love to hear from you. Your support helps the channel grow and motivates me to create even better videos. Thank you so much for your kindness and support. Now, let's get started. My name is David Mercer, and I have been a ranger with the Pisgah National Forest Service for 11 years. I was assigned to a routine backcountry survey on September 14th, examining trail conditions and wildlife activity along the Cradle Ridge Maintenance Sector, a 40-mile circuit through the high country between Mount Pisgah and the Shining Rock Ridge system. The work is straightforward. Walk the trails, document damage, note any hazards, file reports, return. I left the ranger station at 5:47 a.m. on a Wednesday. The morning was cool but not cold. 53 degrees at the station, probably 48 at elevation. My supervisor, Tom Garrett, handed me the assignment sheet while I was loading my pack. Water tower replacement on Graybeard, missing bridge planks on the loop past Sorrel Spring. Usual fall assessment. Should take you 5 days, maybe 6 if the weather turns. I've done this circuit 8 times. The trails are well marked. The elevation changes are predictable. The water sources are reliable. I brought everything I always bring. 2 liters of water initially, a water filter, high-calorie rations for 6 days, a Garmin GPS unit, a handheld radio, my Pisgah sector map marked with GPS waypoints, a compass, a notebook, a first aid kit, a headlamp, emergency shelter, rope, and basic repair supplies, all of it accounted for. All of it standard. The trailhead at Graybeard Ridge parking area sits at 4,200 feet elevation. I logged in at 6:13 a.m. and began the ascent toward the fire tower maintenance trail. The first section climbs steeply through dense rhododendron and Fraser fir. The ridge tops out at 5,847 feet, where the fire lookout tower has stood since 1962. Nobody maintains it anymore. The tower's been dormant for 30 years, but protocol requires annual visual inspection and damage assessment. The morning was quiet in the way mountain mornings usually are. Occasional wind moving through the canopy. Birds calling in the distance. The creek sound from the valley below, muffled by the dense undergrowth. My boots on the wet leaf litter made the only immediate noise, the scrape and crunch of my footsteps rhythmic and familiar. I reached the tower at 7:58 a.m. The structure looked unchanged from my last visit 2 years ago. Metal stairs rust-stained, the observation cabin weathered but intact. I checked the stairs for stability, tested several rungs, and documented 3 new rust spots on the southwest column in my notebook. GPS coordinates 35.2847, minus 82.8933, elevation 5,847 feet. The morning fog was beginning to break, visibility improving to perhaps 300 meters through the Fraser firs. By 9:15 a.m. I was back on the descent trail toward the first water source at Sorrel Spring. The trail down is gentle, following a long ridge with good footing. The day was warming. I was making good time. My legs felt strong. No unusual observations. Just the standard quiet of early autumn in the high mountains, the kind of silence that's actually composed of many small sounds, wind, distant water, insects, the occasional bird call. The silence that only silent seekers can recognize as full and complete. I stopped at Sorrel Spring at 11:42 a.m. to filter water and check my position. The spring flows consistently from a limestone seep, clear and cold. My filter worked properly. I drank maybe a liter total, refilled my primary bottles, and sat for 8 minutes reviewing my map. According to the GPS, I was exactly where I should be. 35.2654, minus 82.9147, 5,102 feet elevation. I marked the location in my notebook with a timestamp. Everything was nominal. The afternoon stretch toward the Cradle Ridge shelter took me through mixed hardwood forest, transitioning to thicker spruce. The trails here are wider, maintained more regularly for the seasonal hunting traffic. By 2:34 p.m. I had covered 14 miles and was at the shelter, a 3-sided structure built in the 1970s with a covered sleeping area and a fire ring out front. I unpacked my gear, assessed the structure for damage, minimal, a few loose shingles, weathering on the roof boards, and prepared for the night. At 4:47 p.m. I compiled my first official entry into my Ranger Report notebook. Day 1, Sept 14. Graybeard Tower, stairs stable, minor rust damage documented. Sorrel Spring, water flow nominal, no wildlife sign of concern. Weather clear, cooling toward evening, no trail hazards observed, no unusual observations. Elevation gain approximately 1,800 feet net, approximately 14 miles covered, all equipment functioning, preparing shelter for overnight. Expected to continue tomorrow morning toward Shining Rock Loop. I ate dinner at 5:52 p.m. A dehydrated beef stew that I reconstituted with water heated on my camp stove. The food was adequate. Not interesting, but adequate. By 6:15 p.m. the daylight was becoming unreliable, the forest floor darkening rapidly. I organized my shelter, checked my equipment one more time, and settled in with my headlamp reading Tom's previous notes about the trail maintenance from the summer before. The shelter faced north, toward the ridge system. I could see the distant line of peaks silhouetted against the last light in the western sky. The darkness came gradually, then suddenly. That's how it works in the mountains. There's no sustained dusk. It's bright, then it's not. By 8:13 p.m. I was attempting to sleep. I did not sleep well. Something about the shelter felt slightly off, though I could not articulate what. The structure was familiar. I had spent perhaps 40 nights here across 11 years. But tonight the proportions seemed marginally different. The sleeping platform felt either shorter or my body had become longer. Unlikely, logically. More likely the fatigue of the day, the mental adjustment to being alone in the forest, the shifting of my awareness away from the structured environment of the ranger station and into this open, minimal space where I was responsible for every decision. I woke at 2:17 a.m. to what I thought was a sound. My headlamp showed nothing unusual. The forest visible through the shelter's open side was undifferentiated darkness broken by the closest trees visible in my light's radius. No animal, no visible movement. But something had disturbed my sleep, an instinct perhaps, or simply the hypersensitivity that comes from being alone. I lay still for perhaps 5 minutes, listening. The forest at 2 a.m. in September produces a specific acoustic environment. Wind in the canopy, occasional, a distant stream somewhere below, the subtle creaks of my own equipment settling. Insects, the utterly ordinary soundscape of a temperate mountain forest at night. But underneath it I felt rather than heard something. A presence, not threatening in any explicit way, just present, the way a person becomes aware of being watched without seeing the watcher. Primitive awareness, the thing in the back of the human brain that has kept our species alive. I turned off my headlamp and lay in darkness, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. After perhaps 20 minutes of this, my own awareness felt absurd and paranoid. There was nothing. I was alone in a ranger shelter in a national forest. This was my job. This was comfortable. I turned the headlamp back on and attempted sleep again. The second sleep lasted perhaps an hour. I woke again at 3:58 a.m., this time certain I had heard something specific. A distant knock. Not a tree falling. I have heard trees fall in the forest, and this was different. A deliberate sound. Rhythmic. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, coming from somewhere down the ridge to the southeast. I listened carefully. Nothing repeated. No animal I have ever encountered in the Appalachian backcountry produces knocking sounds. A woodpecker maybe, but not at 3:58 a.m., and not with that precise, intentional spacing. I lay listening for another hour. The forest remained quiet except for its ordinary sounds. I tried to return to sleep and achieved something approximating at around 5:15 a.m. I woke for the final time at 6:34 a.m., which was before my intended waking time. I decided against trying to sleep further and instead began my morning routine. Bathroom procedures at the designated location 20 meters from the shelter. Water filtering. Breakfast preparation, equipment check, and route review. By 7:12 a.m. I had documented my night observations in the Ranger notebook. Day 2 morning, Sept 14:15. Disturbed sleep, possible unfamiliar animal sound around 2 a.m., more likely wind pattern or rock settling. Distant knocking sound around 4 a.m., likely woodpecker or other bird activity. Fatigue from first day's exertion may be affecting auditory perception. All equipment nominal. Weather clear, cool, possibly warming into afternoon. Proceeding toward Shining Rock maintenance loop as planned. The morning was crisp and clear. I could see for miles from the higher elevations, the ridgelines rolling away to the east toward the South Carolina border. The valleys dropping away in alternating sequences of shadow and visible forest floor. The air was clean and cold, my breathing visible in small clouds. By 8:03 a.m. I was on the trail heading toward the Shining Rock section, the third major waypoint on the circuit. The elevation descended gradually from 5,102 feet at the shelter toward Pigeon River, which ran at approximately 3,800 feet, then climbed again toward the Shining Rock Ridge system on the other side. The trail was in good condition, well marked with blazes painted onto trees at regular intervals. The forest in this section transitions from the spruce and hardwood mix at higher elevations to denser hardwood forest as you descend. Oak, hickory, maple, beech. The undergrowth thickens. The walking becomes slightly more technical, requiring attention to footing over exposed roots and rocky patches. I was making steady progress when, at approximately 10:47 a.m., I noticed something unusual about the trail markers. The painted blazes on the trees, which should be oriented to point the direction of travel, seemed to be facing the wrong direction. Not consistently, just intermittently. A blaze that appeared to be pointing backward appeared every 100 meters or so, mixed in with the correctly oriented ones. At first I thought I might be misreading the marks. The paint is old, faded white on the trees, sometimes visible as clear marks, sometimes appearing almost by accident depending on the light angle. But the more I paid attention, the more certain I became. Some blazes pointed forward, and some pointed backward, seemingly randomly distributed. I consulted my map against my GPS unit. According to both the physical map and my Garmin coordinates, I was on the correct trail. My position at 10:52 a.m. was 35.2411, minus 82.9238, elevation 4,847 feet. The trail to Pigeon River should continue more or less straight ahead, with the river crossing at approximately 35.2219, minus 82.9401. The math was sound. The GPS was tracking correctly, confirmed by checking against my compass bearing, which aligned with the map. So the backward blazes were either errors, old maintenance mistakes, or I was misinterpreting what I was seeing. I decided to trust the GPS coordinates in the map rather than spend time analyzing the blazes. Trail marking errors are not uncommon in maintained but not heavily trafficked areas. I continued down the trail. The temperature rose as the elevation decreased. By 11:30 a.m. I was warm enough that I removed my outer layer and tied it around my waist. The forest was growing thicker, the canopy more complete, the understory denser with rhododendron and mountain laurel. The trail became less distinct in places, making careful attention to blazes backward or forward necessary for navigation. The Pigeon River crossing appeared at 1:08 p.m. The water was running clear and moderately fast, probably 2 to 3 feet deep at the crossing point, which had been reinforced with flagstone steps in previous maintenance work. I could see where last season's work had stabilized the bank erosion on the far side. The crossing was safe, not particularly difficult. I stopped here for lunch, changing into dry socks before attempting the crossing, eating quickly, and refilling my water bottles. At 1:34 p.m. I was across and climbing the far side toward the Shining Rock Ridge, my elevation 3,947 feet, with approximately 2,000 feet of elevation gain ahead before reaching the ridge and the shelter there. The afternoon grew warmer as I climbed, the sun more direct, the humidity thickening. This is typical. The forest, despite the elevation, felt heavy in the way September forests can when the afternoon heat reverses the morning cool. I maintained steady pace, stopping for water and rest every hour or so. At approximately 4:15 p.m., while walking through a section of dense rhododendron where the trail narrowed significantly, I heard a voice. It was distant, unclear, but distinctly human. Male. The words were unintelligible, but the cadence was speech, not animal sound. The voice called out what sounded like a name or greeting, received no answer, and did not repeat. I stopped walking and waited for perhaps 3 minutes, listening. The forest remained quiet. No responding voice, no sound of another person moving through the rhododendron. I checked my map. The nearest maintained trail was the one I was on. The nearest ranger station was approximately 15 miles away to the north. The nearest public road was at least 20 miles distant through difficult terrain. The possibility of another person being in this location was not zero. Hikers do access the Shining Rock area from various entrances, but encountering a voice with no visible source at elevation 4,600 feet, in an area officially below the main hiking routes was unusual. I waited another minute. Nothing repeated. I continued walking, my awareness now heightened. The forest sounded different now that I was actively listening, not changed but more noticeable. The wind in the rhododendron, the creak of branches, a distant bird call, answered by another bird further away. The ordinary sounds of the forest, now suddenly more vivid. I reached the Shining Rock shelter at 6:39 p.m. This structure is larger and better maintained than the Cradle Ridge shelter, with a solid roof, improved weatherproofing, and a built-in water collection system fed by a small spring nearby. I had covered approximately 16 miles that day, with significant elevation change. My legs were tired in the good way, fatigue from honest work. I performed my standard evening routine. Equipment check, camp setup, water collection, dinner preparation, notebook documentation. At 7:56 p.m. I recorded, Day 2, Sept 15. Pigeon River crossing accomplished without difficulty. Trail condition adequate. Minor anomaly noted. Some blazes appear to be oriented incorrectly backward along trail between Cradle Ridge and Pigeon River. GPS and map confirm correct position despite blaze confusion. Possible old maintenance error. Did not investigate further. Unfamiliar voice heard at approximately 4:15 p.m. in rhododendron section. Coordinates approximately 35.2286 minus 82.9356. Elevation 4,600 feet. No response to voice and no visible source identified. Likely another hiker in area. All equipment functioning. Distance covered approximately 16 miles. Preparing shelter for overnight at Shining Rock Station. The evening was clear and cold, the temperature dropping rapidly after sunset. By 8:45 p.m. I was settled into the shelter, reading my sector map to plan the next day's route, consuming a dehydrated dinner, and sipping tea heated on my camp stove. I slept better at Shining Rock Shelter, though my sleep was still fragmented. I woke at 3:22 a.m. to the sound of running water that seemed too loud, too close. The shelter's spring collection system is designed to be quiet, and the actual water flow from the ground is minimal, mostly captured directly into the cistern. But the sound I heard was of significant water movement, almost like rain. I got up and checked. No rain. The night was clear. The cistern was full but not overflowing. The system was functioning normally, but I checked my watch again, 3:22 a.m., and I checked it again at 3:27 a.m. Time seemed to be moving properly, but something felt temporarily off, the kind of disorientation that comes from being suddenly awakened and not being able to quite recalibrate your sense of the time of night. I returned to sleep. I woke at 6:47 a.m. and began my morning routine. The day was clear and cold, the sky beginning to lighten from the east. By 7:30 a.m. I was on the trail again, heading toward the Shining Rock Ridge proper and the tower maintenance site there. The climb that morning was steady and steep. The trail switchbacks up through increasingly sparse forest, the trees getting smaller as the elevation increases past 5,800 feet, the undergrowth transitioning to low scrub and eventually to the rocky exposed ridge. By 9:15 a.m. I had reached the tower site at 6,047 feet elevation. The Shining Rock Fire Tower is smaller than the Graybeard Tower, built in the 1950s rather than the 1960s, but in comparable condition. I performed the same inspection routine, checking stairs, testing structural integrity, documenting any new damage, photographing the structure from standard angles. The process took approximately 1 hour. At 10:34 a.m. I was climbing down from the tower when I noticed something wrong with the view. From the top of the tower, when I looked toward the east and southeast, I should see a specific series of ridgelines and valleys. I have stood on this tower multiple times and know the view. The ridgeline called Shining Rock itself should be visible approximately 2 miles to the southeast, distinctive because of the exposed shale and the silvery appearance that gives the ridge its name. Beyond that, the valley should drop away toward the South Carolina lowlands. The mountains beyond should create a specific pattern of ridges and shadows that I have come to recognize. But the view at the top of the tower this morning seemed flattened. The ridges appeared closer than they should be, not dramatically so, but subtly. The perspective seemed compressed. The distant ridge that should have been clearly 2 miles away appeared to be perhaps half that distance, while still appearing to have the same scale and clarity. I spent perhaps 3 minutes at the top of the tower, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with my memory of the view. There was no clear explanation. Atmospheric conditions can affect distant perception but typically make things appear more distant, not closer. Cloud cover could affect depth perception, but the sky was clear. I came down from the tower and reviewed my map again. The physical geography hadn't changed. Shining Rock Ridge was still where it was supposed to be. My GPS confirmed I was at 35.2947, minus 82.9647, elevation 647 feet. The coordinates aligned with the tower's expected location. I decided I was suffering from fatigue and the optical illusions that can come from high elevation, sleep deprivation, and sustained focus. It was 10:58 a.m. I had not slept well in 2 nights. The elevation was the highest I would reach on this circuit. The optical anomaly was, most likely, exactly that. Optical. I continued down the trail. The descent from Shining Rock Tower goes steeply down through exposed scrub and then into increasingly dense forest. The trail is well maintained but technical in places, with exposed rock and root hazards. By 1:15 p.m. I had descended to 4,900 feet and was approaching the shelter at Sorrel Creek, where I had planned to overnight. The shelter at Sorrel Creek is similar in structure to the Cradle Ridge shelter, 3-sided, built in the 1970s with a fire ring and minimal amenities. The location sits above a reliable creek with good water access and reasonable proximity to both the tower maintenance sites and the main loop trail. I arrived at 1:47 p.m. and performed my camp setup routine. As I was organizing my shelter and unpacking gear, I noticed something unusual about the shelter structure itself. The shelter had 3 walls and an open front. I had stayed here before, most recently about 3 years ago, but I could not recall whether the left wall as I faced it from inside had a small window-like opening or not. The opening was perhaps 2 feet by 2 feet, roughly rectangular, and the edges showed old weathering but did not appear to have been recently damaged. I examined it for approximately 3 minutes, trying to remember if this feature existed the last time I was here. The more I examined it, the more uncertain I became about my own memory. Had the window been here before? The weathering suggested it had been present for years, but I could not construct a clear memory of it. I noted it in my ranger notebook at 2:15 p.m. Window-like opening in left wall of Sorrel Creek shelter. Either present on previous visits or recent damage. Unable to determine which from inspection. Weathering suggests age, no apparent structural compromise from opening. Shelter otherwise functional for overnight. At 3:30 p.m., while collecting water from the creek, I heard the voice again. It was closer this time, and the words were slightly more clear. Male voice, calling out what sounded like a name. The words sounded like "A," or possibly "A there." The voice had an accent that might have been Appalachian, or might have just been my interpretation based on geographic context. I stood still at the creek for approximately 4 minutes, calling back "hello," loudly enough to be heard at distance. "This is a ranger. Is there an emergency?" No response came. The forest remained quiet except for the creek sound and the wind in the trees. I filled my water containers and returned to the shelter, my awareness now actively alert in a way that made rational thought difficult. Another person in the area was possible. The voice could be carried by unusual acoustic conditions. My hearing could be affected by fatigue and stress, but the specific combination of the voice I had heard yesterday, the voice I heard today, and the absence of any response or visible sign of another person was beginning to produce a low-level anxiety that was difficult to ignore. I spent the afternoon organizing my notes and reviewing my route plan. Tomorrow I would continue to the Loop Trail Junction and begin the western leg of the circuit toward Devil's Head and the final leg back toward the starting point. By 6 p.m. I had consumed dinner and was sitting near the shelter's fire ring, reading my map in the fading daylight while sipping tea. The temperature was dropping rapidly. I could see my breath becoming visible as the sun moved lower. At 6:52 p.m. I documented the day. Day 3, Sept 1516. Shining Rock Tower inspection completed without incident. Unusual optical effect observed from tower top. Distant ridge lines appeared compressed or closer than expected. Likely optical illusion from fatigue and elevation. Descended to Sorrel Creek shelter by 1:47 p.m. Possible human voice heard again near creek at approximately 3:30 p.m. Called out without response. Acoustic anomaly or weather effect possible. Checked shelter structure, found small window opening in left wall, uncertain whether opening was present on previous visits or is recent damage, unable to determine cause from inspection. Shelter structure otherwise sound, all equipment functioning, temperature dropping toward evening, preparing for overnight. The night at Sorrel Creek was colder than previous nights. I used both layers of sleeping insulation and still felt the cold moving through the shelter from the creek valley. The shelter's open front made complete thermal closure impossible, and the opening I had noticed in the left wall allowed additional airflow. I slept in segments, waking repeatedly from the cold and from dreams I could not recall clearly upon waking. At one point, I checked my watch and recorded 4:33 a.m. I woke to what I thought was the sound of something moving through the forest behind the shelter. A large animal, perhaps. The sound of branches being displaced by something moving deliberately through the undergrowth. I lay still and listened, but the sound did not repeat. I waited approximately 5 minutes, then turned on my headlamp and looked toward the area where I thought the sound had come from. Nothing was visible, no eyes reflected in the beam, no movement. I turned off the light and returned to attempting sleep. I woke at 6:14 a.m. to the sound of my own breathing, which seemed loud in the cold morning silence. The stream of condensation visible from each breath created a small visual anchor to my place in the physical world. I was here, in this shelter, in the mountains, still alive. The morning routine happened almost automatically. Bathroom procedures, water collection and filtering, breakfast preparation, equipment check, route review. The procedural nature of the actions grounded me, gave structure to the strangeness of the previous days. By 7:45 a.m. I was on the trail again, heading toward the loop trail junction approximately 8 miles away. This section of the route descends gradually from 4,900 feet toward 4,200 feet and is considered one of the more straightforward and well-marked segments of the circuit. The morning was clear and cold. Frost was visible on low vegetation. The sun, when it broke through the canopy, was bright and clean. The forest felt less oppressive in daylight than it had during the previous evening's darkness. I walked steadily, making good pace. By 9:30 a.m. I had covered approximately 4 miles and was approaching a creek crossing at the bottom of a particularly steep descent. The trail here switchbacks down through dense hardwood forest, and the switchbacks are regular and well-maintained. But something was wrong with the switchback's geometry. The trail should descend in a specific pattern. Steep section, switchback, another steep section, another switchback. The number of switchbacks should be consistent with the elevation drop. Over the distance I had just covered, there should have been approximately 6 switchbacks if my memory was accurate, but I was uncertain of my count. I had counted the switchbacks as I descended, almost automatically, an unconscious habit of noting the trail structure. And I had counted 7 or 8. I was not certain which. The difference of one switchback should be traceable back through my memory, a clear additional turn that I should be able to visualize. But when I tried to mentally reconstruct the descent, the switchbacks became a blur of turning and descent, and I could not accurately recreate the exact sequence. I stopped at the creek crossing and consulted my map. According to the map, this was the correct location. The GPS confirmed position at 35.2164 minus 82.9512, elevation 4,187 feet, which matched the expected crossing point. So either my count of switchbacks was incorrect, which was possible, given fatigue and the repetitive nature of the actions, or something about the trail geometry was subtly wrong in a way that I could not articulate. I spent approximately 3 minutes trying to think back through the descent, trying to recall the exact number of turns and whether the spacing between them had been consistent. The more I focused on the memory, the less stable it became, fragmenting into component sensations, the feeling of turning, the sound of my boots, the branches I had passed. Without forming a coherent sequence that I could count, I decided to stop trying to force the memory and instead trust the map and GPS. The coordinates were correct, the terrain matched the map representation. My overthinking about the switchbacks was likely a sign of fatigue and stress affecting my perceptual processing. I continued forward. The loop trail junction appeared at 11:18 a.m. This is a major waypoint where 2 routes diverge, one continuing toward Devil's Head in the western leg of the circuit, the other heading toward one of the park's public areas on the periphery. A sign here provides mileage and direction information for each route, but something was wrong with the sign. The signpost was where it should be, and the sign structure was standard, wooden arms pointing in different directions with distances painted on them. But the directions seemed to be pointing in unexpected ways. The arm pointing toward Devil's Head, which should point northwest, appeared to be pointing more northward than northwest. The arm pointing back the way I came, which should point southeast, appeared to be pointing more eastward. I stood in front of the sign for approximately 2 minutes, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with my understanding of the geography. I pulled out my compass and took a bearing on the Devil's Head direction arm. The compass indicated the sign was pointing approximately 20 degrees off from the correct northwest heading. This was a material error. Trail markers being 20 degrees off from correct direction represents a significant navigation hazard for hikers without GPS. I noted this in my ranger report at 11:26 a.m. Day 4, Sept 16. Loop Trail Junction sign shows directional error. Devil's Head arm pointing approximately 20 degrees too far east toward north-northeast rather than northwest. Potentially hazardous for navigation. Will document for maintenance team follow-up. Continuing toward Devil's Head via GPS and map rather than sign guidance. I proceeded toward Devil's Head using my GPS unit as primary navigation rather than trusting the trail signs. The morning had become strange in ways I could not fully articulate, and the navigation error had heightened my attention to the accuracy of the environment around me. The trail toward Devil's Head climbs gradually back up elevation, regaining altitude lost in the previous descent. This section is less densely forested and more open, with better views of the surrounding ridge system. By 1:45 p.m. I had reached approximately 4,600 feet elevation and could see the distinctive ridge feature known as Devil's Head, a rocky outcropping that resembles a devil-like silhouette when viewed from certain angles. I stopped at a convenient overlook to eat lunch and check my position. According to my GPS, I was at 35.2307 minus 82.8954, elevation 4,587 feet. The overlook gave clear views of the surrounding terrain, and I could see what I believed to be the correct ridge system matching my map. But the distance to certain landmarks seemed wrong. Pigeon Ridge, which should be approximately 3 miles to the northeast, appeared to be much closer, perhaps only 1 mile away. The perception was not dramatic enough to be clearly mistaken as hallucination, but it was consistent with the compressed depth perception I had experienced at the top of the shining rock tower. I checked my map, my GPS, and my compass. All 3 instruments indicated correct position. The geography I could see matched the topographic representation on the paper map, but my visual perception of distance was contradicting the instruments. I sat at the overlook for approximately 20 minutes. Eating mechanically while focusing on the distant ridge and trying to understand the disconnect. The more I focused on trying to judge distance, the more unstable the perception became. At times the ridge appeared the correct distance, at other times it appeared very close, at other times I could not judge distance at all and was simply seeing a visual field with no reliable depth. At 2:15 p.m. I stopped trying to rationalize the perception and simply ate my food, drank my water, and moved on. The trail continued toward the Devil's Head shelter, which was approximately another 4 miles away. The afternoon was growing warmer, the sun more direct, the humidity increasing. My water consumption increased correspondingly. I refilled at one of the small creek crossings around 3:30 p.m., using my filter to clean the water before drinking. The Devil's Head shelter sits in a small sheltered valley, surrounded by dense rhododendron forest with good protection from wind. I arrived at 5:47 p.m., having covered approximately 14 miles that day. The shelter was in good condition, with a solid roof and adequate weatherproofing. I was performing my camp setup when I noticed the shelter's interior configuration seemed to be different from what I remembered. The sleeping platform runs along the back wall of the shelter, perpendicular to the front opening. I have slept on this platform before, and I remember it as being constructed of rough-hewn wooden logs arranged in a bed-like configuration. Tonight, the platform appeared to have additional structure, something like a raised frame or additional support system that I did not recall being present. I examined the platform for approximately 5 minutes. The construction showed considerable age and weathering. It was entirely possible the additional structure had been there on my previous visit and I had simply not noticed or had forgotten. But the uncertainty was growing. The wrong switchback count, the misaligned trail sign, the compressed depth perception, the window in the Sorrel Creek shelter, the additional structure in the Devil's Head platform, small things individually, but accumulating into a pattern of environmental details that did not match either my memory or my expectations. At 6:34 p.m. I documented, Day 4, Sept 16. Loop Trail Junction sign shows directional error as documented, Trail conditions generally acceptable despite navigation issues. Depth perception anomaly observed again from overlook near Devil's Head. Distant ridgelines appearing closer than map-indicated distances. Fatigue and elevation likely contributing factors. Arrived at Devil's Head Shelter at 5:47 p.m. Shelter platform configuration appears to differ from previous visits. Appears to have additional structural elements, though weathering suggests age. Maybe memory error on my part. All equipment functioning. Temperature warming toward evening. The evening at Devil's Head was warmer than previous nights, the valley providing protection from wind and better thermal retention. I slept more deeply than I had in previous nights, though I still woke multiple times. At 1:23 a.m., at 3:47 a.m., and finally waking for the day at 6:22 a.m. By the morning of day 5, a pattern was becoming apparent to me, though I was uncertain how to articulate it in my ranger documentation. The environment around me was internally consistent in terms of hard data. GPS coordinates, compass bearings, elevation readings, map alignment, but increasingly inconsistent in terms of sensory perception and memory. My instruments and maps agreed with each other. My eyes and ears were disagreeing with both. I was experiencing what might be described as persistent perceptual anomalies in a context where those anomalies could not be easily dismissed as equipment failure or obvious misunderstanding. The morning hike began at 6:58 a.m., with the plan to continue from Devil's Head toward the western leg of the circuit, heading through the Shining Rock Ledge area toward the final shelter before returning to the starting point. The trail that morning climbed gently through mixed forest, the elevation increasing gradually from 4,600 feet toward 5,200 feet. The morning was clear and cool. The forest felt normal in ways I could not quite define but very clearly sensed. The ambient light was correct. The sound patterns were familiar. The smells of damp earth and vegetation were present in expected amounts. By 9:15 a.m. I had reached a ridge overlook that provides clear views toward the north and west. From this overlook, I should be able to see approximately 40 to 50 miles of terrain, multiple ridge systems, several valleys, and in clear weather the distant mountains of the North Carolina-Tennessee border region. But the view from the overlook this morning was unusual. The landscape visible was approximately 2 miles deep. Beyond 2 miles, the terrain became increasingly indistinct, fading into a kind of visual fog that was not present in clear weather conditions. The effect was similar to the compressed depth perception I had experienced before, but more complete and more obviously wrong. I stood at the overlook and adjusted my vision, closing and opening my eyes, trying to see if there was some optical effect I could correct. The visual field remained compressed regardless of how I focused. I then took out my topographic map and tried to match what I was seeing to what should be visible. According to the map, the ridge system visible in the distance should include features that were clearly 40 to 50 miles away, but in my visual field, those features appeared to be 10 or 15 miles distant at most. I spent approximately 8 minutes at the overlook, trying different approaches to understanding the visual anomaly. None of the approaches provided clarity. I could see the landscape, and the landscape was visually consistent and detailed, but the scale and distance relationships seemed fundamentally wrong. The simplest explanation was atmospheric. Unusual weather conditions, high humidity, or particulates in the air could affect visibility in ways that compressed apparent distance. This was not a normal condition for clear weather, but unusual conditions do occur. I accepted this explanation and continued hiking. The trail descended from the ridge into a valley and then climbed again toward a series of rocky outcroppings collectively called Shining Rock Ledge. This section of trail is more technically difficult, with significant scrambling over exposed rock in places. The hiking requires careful attention to footing and route finding. At approximately 11:40 a.m., while scrambling over a particularly steep rock face, I heard what I initially thought was another hiker approaching from behind. The sound was unmistakable. Boots on rock, breathing, the rattle of a backpack. The sounds were clear and distinct. I paused on the rock face and turned to look downslope. Nobody was visible. I waited for perhaps 30 seconds, watching the trail section below me where I had just come from. The sounds continued briefly. I distinctly heard what sounded like someone making the same scramble up the rock face, the same boot sounds on stone, the same backpack rattle, and then abruptly ceased. The silence that followed was complete and immediate. Not the gradual cessation of sound that would come from a hiker continuing up the trail and moving beyond earshot, but rather an instant silence, as though the sounds had been switched off. I stood on the rock face for approximately 2 minutes, every nerve in my body suddenly alert in ways that were difficult to manage. The rational parts of my brain offered multiple explanations: echo, acoustic anomaly, my own sounds being reflected back to me from the rock formations, auditory confusion from fatigue, but the experience had been specific and consistent. I had clearly heard someone behind me, and then the sound had stopped completely. I continued climbing, but my attention was now divided. Part of my awareness remained focused on the trail behind me, listening for sounds that might indicate another person was following. The shining rock ledge shelter appeared at 2:23 p.m. This shelter is similar in design to the others, three-sided with an open front, but positioned at high elevation, 5,187 feet, with clear views across multiple valleys. It is a good location for overnight stay and is the final shelter before the circuit turns toward home. I arrived at the shelter and immediately began setting up camp, moving through the procedures quickly without fully engaging with each action. My mind was occupied with the auditory experience on the rock face and with increasingly clear recognition that something about this patrol was not normal. By 3:45 p.m. I had settled at the shelter and sat reviewing my map and notes. I needed to take stock of what was actually happening versus what I was interpreting. The facts: I have been hiking for 5 days. All GPS coordinates have been consistent with correct position. All compass bearings have been accurate. Map features have aligned correctly with terrain. However, trail markers showed error. Backward blazes, misaligned junction sign. Nath perception has been compressed in multiple instances. I have perceived human voices with no visible source. I have heard auditory signs of a person following with no visible person. Environmental details, shelter features, platform structures appear to have changed from memory. Switchback count seemed off. The possible explanations: 1. Severe sleep deprivation affecting perception likely. 2. High altitude effects on cognition possible. 3. Stress and isolation causing psychological responses likely. 4. Equipment failure affecting navigation unlikely given consistency. 5. Environmental acoustic anomalies and optical illusions likely. 6. An actual person in the area whose presence I am perceiving but not clearly identifying possible but increasingly unlikely. 7. Deliberate misremembering due to stress or trauma possible. 8. Something other than any of the above unlikely but remaining as undefined possibility. I documented this analysis in my Ranger notebook at 4:12 p.m., being careful to note both the objective facts and my uncertainty about interpretation. Day 5, Sep 17. Compressed depth perception observed again from ridge overlook toward northwest-west. Atmospheric conditions clear, but visible landscape appears limited to approximately 2-3 miles depth. Possibly unusual atmospheric effect. On trail near shining rock ledge, heard apparent person behind me, footsteps, backpack noise with no visible person in area. Sound abruptly ceased. Possibly auditory reflection from rock formations or my own sounds. Reviewing weak, consistent navigation data, inconsistent sensory perception. Considering multiple causative factors including fatigue, elevation effect, stress, acoustic anomaly. Continuing patrol as planned. Arriving shining rock ledge shelter at 2:23 p.m. Final shelter before return leg. Feeling increasingly uncertain about perceptual reliability. That evening I attempted to take detailed inventory of all my equipment and supplies to ensure nothing was malfunctioning or missing. The GPS unit functioned normally. The compass was accurate. The map was correct. All radios and communication equipment were functional. My food supplies were adequate. My water treatment was working. I called in a radio check to the ranger station at 5:47 p.m. Tom answered immediately. "Mercer, how's the circuit going?" His voice came through clear, with minimal static. "All fine. Making good time. Should be back by tomorrow afternoon," I said. "Copy. Any issues out there?" I paused before responding. How would I explain the perceptual anomalies to Tom? How would I articulate a concern that was based on optical illusions and sounds with no clear source? Nothing significant. Trail condition is good. Some navigation marker issues. The loop trail junction sign is misaligned by about 20 degrees. I'll document it for maintenance. Copy that. We'll add it to the maintenance schedule. See you tomorrow, Mercer. Copy. Check in from the final leg tomorrow morning. Mercer out. I ended the radio transmission and sat holding the radio unit for a moment. The conversation had been ordinary. Tom had no concern about my status. The network was functioning. I was expected back tomorrow. The night at Shining Rock Ledge was clear and cold. I slept relatively well, waking only twice during the night, at 2:34 a.m. and again at 5:16 a.m. The final leg of the circuit was designed to return to the starting point at Graybeard Ridge parking area. The route descended from 5,187 feet at Shining Rock Ledge toward the parking area at 4,200 feet, covering approximately 12 miles through terrain I had already traveled on the first 2 days of the patrol. I departed the shelter at 7:19 a.m. on day 6, the morning of my intended return. The day was clear and cool, the weather holding stable. I was planning to complete the circuit by approximately 2 p.m., return to the ranger station, and file my official report. The trail descended through familiar terrain, the same rhododendron sections, the same creek crossings, the same ridge features I had observed during the first 2 days. The familiarity should have been comforting, but instead it produced a subtle unease. The terrain looked correct. The elevation changes matched memory. The landmarks were in expected positions, but the distances were wrong. Segments of trail that I remembered as taking approximately 1 hour to traverse appeared to take only 30 or 40 minutes. Other sections that seemed short during the ascent now appeared to take longer. The overall effect was of a landscape that had been subtly rearranged, not in any dramatic way, but in ways that made navigation feel unstable. I was relying entirely on GPS navigation now rather than trail landmarks or memory. The GPS data was consistent. My position was updating accurately. My bearing toward the parking area was clear. By 10:15 a.m. I had reached the Cradle Ridge shelter for the second time. I had passed through this shelter on day 2 of the patrol. I had not spent the night there, having proceeded to Sorrel Creek instead. The shelter appeared unchanged from my previous observations. I did not stop for long. I refilled water and continued toward the final leg, the descent to Sorrel Spring and then on to Graybeard Ridge in the parking area. But something was different about the trail between Cradle Ridge Shelter and Sorrel Spring. The trail should descend approximately 800 feet of elevation while covering roughly 5 miles of distance. The route should pass through mixed forest, with a reliable water source at Sorrel Spring at approximately the midway point. I began the descent at 10:28 a.m. with full water bottles and an expectation of reaching the parking area by approximately 2 p.m. What happened instead was that the trail seemed to continue longer than expected. By 11:45 a.m., I calculated that I should have descended 600 feet and covered roughly 3.5 miles, placing me very close to Sorrel Spring. But the elevation reading on my GPS showed only 4,850 feet. I should have been at approximately 4,400 feet or lower by this point in the route. I stopped walking and rechecked my GPS position. According to the unit, I was at coordinates 35.2634, minus 82.9212, elevation 4,851 feet. The date and time showed 11:48 a.m. September 17. I was lost. Not in the sense of being unable to find my way. The GPS would get me to the parking area. But I was lost in the sense that the terrain around me did not match the expected position according to my previous experience of the landscape. I consulted my map. According to the map and GPS, I should be at approximately the location where I had filtered water at Sorrel Spring on day 2. But Sorrel Spring did not match the surrounding terrain. The forest composition was wrong. The slope angle was wrong. The creek sound was present. I could hear water in the distance, but coming from the wrong direction. I walked forward approximately 200 meters and rechecked my position. The GPS now showed 35.2649, minus 82.9187, elevation 4,823 feet. I was continuing downslope as expected, but the terrain around me still did not match the expected environment. I made a decision at this point that I would navigate by GPS coordinates alone, setting a direct bearing toward the parking area waypoint and hiking directly toward it, rather than attempting to follow the trail. At 11:56 a.m. I took a bearing on the parking area location, coordinates 35.2912, minus 82.8634, using my GPS unit. The bearing was approximately 29 degrees roughly northeast. The distance to the parking area according to the GPS distance calculator was approximately 8.2 miles. Based on typical hiking pace, that meant I could expect to arrive at approximately 3:30 to 4 p.m. depending on terrain difficulty. I left the trail and began hiking cross-country. using my GPS as navigation guide and maintaining compass bearing when possible. The cross-country hiking was more difficult than trail hiking. The terrain was steep and densely forested. I frequently had to backtrack to find passages around impenetrable rhododendron thickets. The undergrowth grabbed at my clothing, low branches struck my face, but I was navigating by GPS and compass, and those instruments were providing consistent data. By 1:30 p.m. I had covered approximately 1.5 miles of cross-country distance, descending roughly 300 feet in elevation. According to my GPS, I was at 35.2744, minus 82.9089, elevation 4,521 feet. This placed me closer to the parking area, with approximately 6.8 miles remaining. I stopped for water and a quick rest. My legs were beginning to feel the accumulated fatigue of 6 days of hiking. My water consumption had increased due to the exertion of cross-country hiking. By 2:15 p.m. I was hiking again, pushing forward across terrain that was becoming increasingly impassable. The forest density was limiting forward progress. I was moving at perhaps half my normal hiking pace, and the distance remaining, over 6.5 miles, would take approximately 4 to 5 hours to cover at this rate. This meant I would not reach the parking area until after dark, perhaps 6:30 p.m. or later. I made another calculation at this point. The simplest path was to return to the trail, even if the trail's geographical configuration was confusing. The trail would be easier to navigate even if the distance perception was unstable. The trail would be safer for hiking after dark, being more established and having fewer obstacles. At 2:31 p.m. I took a bearing back toward where I calculated the main trail should be and began hiking in that direction. Within approximately 300 meters I had found the trail again. The GPS coordinates showed 35.2778. minus 82.9156, elevation 4,456 feet. The elevation gain and loss over the previous 30 minutes of cross-country navigation had been minimal. The terrain around the trail looked more familiar, matching more closely my expectation of what this section of the circuit should look like. I calculated time and distance remaining. If I was at 4,456 feet elevation and the parking area was at 4,200 feet, I had approximately 250 feet of descent remaining. The distance to the parking area was approximately 6.5 miles according to my latest GPS reading. This meant I should be able to reach the parking area in approximately 3 hours, arriving around 5:30 p.m. Not dark, but close. Not ideal, but manageable. I continued hiking, maintaining steady pace and watching my GPS position update periodically. But something strange began to happen with the GPS coordinates. At 2:47 p.m., my position was 35.2791, minus 82.9174. 5 minutes later, at 2:52 p.m., my position was 35.2803 minus 82.9179. Both positions indicated roughly the same direction of movement toward the parking area and consistent elevation descent, but the rate of change in GPS coordinates was slower than my hiking speed should have produced. If I was hiking at approximately 3 miles per hour, a reasonable downhill hiking pace, I should be covering approximately 0.08 miles per minute. The GPS coordinate change of 0012 degrees of latitude and 0005 degrees of longitude represented a distance of approximately 0.1 miles, which was consistent with the time elapsed. Mathematically, the GPS was accurate, but the subjective experience of my hiking, the distance I felt I was covering relative to the terrain passing beneath me, seemed to be producing more movement than the GPS was recording. The effect was subtly disorienting. My body felt like it was moving at a steady pace down the mountain. The terrain beneath my feet was passing in a normal rhythm. The time was passing normally, but the GPS was indicating that I was covering distance at a slower rate than my body's kinesthetic sense suggested. I stopped for a moment to assess whether the GPS unit might be malfunctioning. I checked the unit's display. The signal strength was good, the coordinates were updating regularly. The elevation tracking was smooth and consistent with downhill descent. The unit appeared to be functioning normally. I continued hiking. By 3:45 p.m. my GPS showed position 35.2854 minus 82.9088, elevation 4,267 feet. I was very close to the parking area. The coordinates 35.2912 minus 82.8634 at elevation 4,200 feet should be only another 1 to 2 kilometers away. The terrain around me was becoming more familiar. I was beginning to recognize specific features, a distinctive rock formation I remembered passing on day one, a particular section of trail marked with carved initials on one of the trees, a specific turn in the trail where the view opened briefly toward a distant ridge. These recognizable features suggested I was very close to the parking area. At 3:52 p.m. I came around a bend in the trail and saw the parking area access road approximately 300 meters ahead. I reached the parking lot at 3:58 p.m. The parking area appeared normal. My vehicle was present. No other vehicles were in the lot. The ranger station was approximately 2 miles away from the parking area via the main road. I stood in the parking lot for approximately 3 minutes, simply standing and breathing, feeling the physical reality of solid ground and open space after 6 days in the forest. I then checked my ranger GPS unit one final time. Position 35.2912 minus 82.8642, elevation 4,201 feet, time 3:59 p.m. The coordinates were consistent with the parking area location. Everything indicated I had successfully completed the circuit as planned. I drove to the ranger station, arriving at 4:18 p.m. Tom was at his desk reviewing paperwork when I entered. He looked up from his work. "You're back early," he said. "Thought you'd be here closer to evening." "Made good time," I said. Trail conditions allowed for steady pace. "Everything okay?" Tom asked. The question was routine, but I sensed something in his tone. Perhaps just my own heightened sensitivity that suggested he was actually asking if everything was okay in a deeper sense than just trail conditions. "Fine. Trail markers need attention at the Loop Trail Junction. Other than that, conditions are good. I'll file my complete report." I spent the next 2 hours in the ranger station office, documenting my findings on the official incident report form. I included observations about the trail conditions, the misaligned junction sign, the tower conditions, and general environmental assessments. I did not include observations about the backward trail blazes, the depth perception anomalies, the mysterious voices, the changed shelf features, or the discrepancy between perceived hiking distance and GPS distance covered. These observations seemed too subjective, too difficult to document in a way that would not invite concern about my mental state. And by the time I was writing the report, I was beginning to adopt more rational interpretations of all the strange events. Backward blazes could be old maintenance mistakes or my own mislabeling of direction. Depth perception could be atmospheric effect or fatigue. The voices could be audio illusions or auditory processing errors. The environmental features could be my memory being unreliable. The cumulative weight of strangeness was significant, but individually each event had a plausible alternative explanation. My report, filed at 6:47 p.m., was professionally written, detailed, and contained no mention of anything unusual except the objective fact of the misaligned trail sign at the Loop Trail Junction. Tom reviewed the report and signed it. "Good work, Mercer. You seem tired." "6 days in the backcountry," I said. "Gets tiring. You should take a few days off. Recover. You're not scheduled for anything until next week." I agreed that I would take the time to rest and recover. I drove home to my apartment in the small town that sits at the base of the mountains, approximately 15 miles from the ranger station. I showered, consumed a normal dinner from my kitchen, and attempted to sleep at a normal hour. But sleep was difficult. I lay in my bed in my apartment, in the dark, in silence, and found myself unable to fully relax. My mind kept returning to specific moments from the patrol. The moment I heard the first voice and saw nobody. The moment I realized the trail blazes were backward. The moment I perceived the auditory presence of another hiker who was not there. These moments were real. They were memories of actual events that had occurred, but their interpretation remained unstable in my mind. Reality or illusion, perception or misperception, signal or noise. I slept in fragments that night, and when I did sleep, my dreams incorporated elements from the forest. The specific combination of forest smells and sounds, the visual field of walking through dense rhododendron, the endless rhythm of putting one foot in front of the other. I woke at 5:30 a.m. before the sun, and lay in bed watching the ceiling gradually brighten as the morning light approached. By 8 a.m. I was awake and attempting to function in the normal world. The following days, the rest of that week, were strange in a different way than the patrol had been strange. I moved through the routines of normal life, eating meals, dealing with ordinary tasks, attempting to engage with the external world. But I remained somewhat detached from the experience, as though I were observing myself from a slight distance. I did not return to the ranger station. Tom had given me the time off, and I used it to rest and attempt to recover from the patrol. By Friday, 4 days after returning from the patrol, I made a decision. I would return to the Pisgah sector and attempt to trace specific points from the patrol to determine whether my observations had been accurate or whether I had been experiencing perceptual distortions. I did not inform Tom of this decision. I simply prepared my equipment on Friday evening and planned to return to the forest on Saturday morning. I returned to the Graybeard Ridge trailhead at 6:34 a.m. on Saturday, September 22nd, 8 days after completing the first patrol. The morning was clear and cool, similar to the morning of the first patrol. My intention was specific. I would retrace only the first section of the circuit, hiking from Graybeard Ridge to the fire tower, then back down to Sorrel Spring, and then returning to my vehicle. The entire hike should take approximately 6 hours, completing by approximately 1 p.m. The purpose was to determine whether the backward trail blazes still existed, whether the trail geometry was stable, and whether the environment showed signs of the changes I had perceived during the first patrol. The hike began normally. I climbed from the parking area toward the tower, the trail rising steadily through the familiar rhododendron and fir forest. By 8:11 a.m. I had reached the tower, checked its condition, stable, unchanged, and begun descending toward Sorrel Spring. As I descended, I paid careful attention to the trail blazes. The blazes were present and appeared to be pointing in the correct direction, forward along the route, not backward. I did not see the anomalous backward-facing blazes that I believed I had observed during the first patrol. Either the blazes had been corrected, or I had misinterpreted them the first time. I reached Sorrel Spring at 10:22 a.m. and performed water filtering and hydration procedures. I examined the immediate area around the spring carefully, comparing it to my memory and to my first-day observations. The landscape appeared unchanged. The water flow was consistent with my first observation. The surrounding forest and the terrain configuration matched my expectations. I continued to Cradle Ridge Shelter, arriving at 11:47 a.m. The shelter appeared completely normal. I examined the interior carefully, looking for the window opening I had observed in the Sorrel Creek shelter during the first patrol. There was no window opening in any of the walls of the Cradle Ridge Shelter. There was no additional structure in the sleeping platform. Everything appeared to be standard and unchanged. By 1:05 p.m. I was back at my vehicle. The round trip had taken approximately 6.5 hours, which was consistent with a two-person hiking pace covering approximately 12 miles with minimal stops. All the terrain had appeared normal. All the markings and structures had appeared to match expectations. There had been no strange voices, no auditory illusions, no perceptual anomalies. I sat in my vehicle in the parking area for approximately 10 minutes, processing the experience of retracing the route and finding everything apparently normal. The simplest conclusion was that the entire set of perceptual anomalies I had experienced during the first patrol had been the result of fatigue, isolation, stress, and the psychological effects of being alone in the backcountry for 6 consecutive days. The second patrol had been uneventful precisely because I was not in the altered psychological state that had characterized the first patrol. I drove back to the ranger station and found Tom at his desk. "Thought you were resting," he said. "I was, but I wanted to check something," I said. "Trail conditions look good. I confirmed the loop trail junction sign is still misaligned, but I wanted to verify the trail condition since I was out there anyway." "Okay, you look better. The rest was good?" "Yeah. The forest is clear. Conditions are solid." Tom nodded and returned to his paperwork. The conversation ended. I left the ranger station without filing a new report, without documenting the second patrol, without including it in any official record. The event was essentially erased from any official documentation. The following 3 weeks were marked by a gradual process of rationalization and compartmentalization. During my normal work responsibilities, office duties at the ranger station, routine equipment maintenance, administrative tasks, I functioned normally. I participated in staff meetings, discussed trail conditions with other rangers, and processed standard maintenance requests. But outside of work hours, I found myself unable to fully engage with normal life activities. I would find myself, in the evening or during my off days, thinking about specific moments from the first patrol, the specific quality of the light coming through the rhododendron canopy at particular times, the exact acoustic properties of the shelter's interior, the precise arrangement of shadows on the trail. These were not memories of dramatic or frightening events. They were memories of normal activities. Hiking, setting up camp, filtering water, eating meals, but they were persistently present in my consciousness in a way that normal vacation memories were not. I did not experience classic anxiety symptoms. I did not have nightmares or panic attacks. I simply remained unusually aware of details from the patrol, and I remained uncertain about which of my perceptions during that time had been accurate reflections of reality and which had been products of fatigue or stress. On October 6th, approximately 3 weeks after the first patrol, I was asked to complete a similar route patrol, a 5-day circuit through a different sector of the forest, the cathedral section roughly northwest of my usual Pisgah territory. This was a standard rotation. Other rangers covered the Pisgah sector while I was assigned elsewhere. I accepted the assignment without indicating any hesitation or concern. The cathedral circuit is similar in structure to the Pisgah circuit. Multiple shelters, established trail network, routine maintenance and inspection work. The terrain is comparable, with similar elevation ranges and forest composition. I prepared my equipment and supplies using my standard procedures. I discussed the assignment with Tom, who outlined the specific maintenance needs and trail assessment requirements. The morning of October 7, I departed for the Cathedral Sector trailhead. The circuit began normally. First day of the Cathedral Patrol mirrored the first day of the Pisgah Patrol. Approximately 14 miles covered. Arrival at a sheltered campsite. Evening documentation, standard sleep. But on the second day of the Cathedral Patrol, I began noticing something unusual about the trail itself. The trail geometry seemed subtly different from what the topographic map indicated. The switchbacks appeared to be in different positions than the map showed. The elevation gain and loss seemed to not quite match the visual terrain. I checked my GPS repeatedly. The coordinates were correct. My position aligned with my expected location. The GPS data was consistent and reliable, but the subjective experience of the landscape did not match the objective data. By midday on the second day of the Cathedral Patrol, I realized I was beginning to experience the same perceptual distortions that had characterized the later stages of the first patrol. I made a decision at this point that I have not discussed with anyone and that I have not documented in any official report. I decided to conduct a systematic test of my perceptual capabilities versus the objective data from my instruments. I selected a specific location on the trail, a prominent ridge feature with clear views in multiple directions. I documented my position using GPS coordinates, compass bearings, elevation reading, and timestamp. I then made detailed visual observations about what I could see, estimating distances to visible landmarks using various techniques, comparing apparent size to map-known sizes of features, attempting to use visual angle subtending techniques, and comparing to my memory of previous observations from similar locations. I then waited 30 minutes and repeated the process at the exact same location. The GPS coordinates were identical. Repeated measurements confirmed position to within 5 meters. The elevation was identical. The compass bearings were identical. Everything objective was stable, but my visual perception of distance had shifted between the first and second measurement. Landmarks that appeared relatively close in the first observation appeared significantly further in the second observation. The depth of the landscape seemed to have expanded. I noted the discrepancy carefully in my ranger notebook. I then continued hiking and repeated the process at a different location approximately 3 hours later. At this new location, the same phenomenon occurred. Identical GPS data, identical objective position, but shifted visual perception of distance. For the remainder of the Cathedral Patrol, I conducted this systematic observation, carefully documenting both the objective GPS compass elevation data and my subjective visual observations. The pattern was consistent. The objective instruments were stable and reliable. My visual perception of distance and landscape depth was variable and unstable, shifting over time periods ranging from 30 minutes to several hours. I completed the Cathedral Patrol on October 11 and returned to the ranger station with a complete documentation of these observations in my personal ranger notebook. I did not include these observations in my official report. The official report was straightforward. Trail conditions are good, routine maintenance items documented, No significant hazards observed, but my personal notebook contained detailed observations about the discrepancy between objective instrument data and subjective visual perception. The third patrol, a 4-day assignment in the Shining Creek sector, one of the peripheral areas of my assigned region, occurred between October 18 and October 21. By this point, I had developed a hypothesis about what was occurring. My hypothesis was that my visual perceptual system was producing unstable distance perception, and that this instability was being triggered by some aspect of being in the backcountry environment for extended periods. The instability was not dramatic or obviously hallucinatory. It was subtle, just enough to create a discrepancy between what my eyes were reporting and what my instruments were measuring. This hypothesis had several testable elements. 1. The instability should be consistently present in all backcountry patrols. 2. The instability should be specifically related to depth perception, not affecting color, contrast, or other visual features. 3. The instability should not affect my ability to function in the environment. 4. The instability should not be correlated with specific times of day, weather conditions, or altitude. I began to test these elements during the Shining Creek patrol. The Shining Creek sector contains smaller shelter sites and shorter trail segments than the Pisgah or Cathedral circuits. The patrol was designed to cover approximately 35 miles in 4 days, a roughly equivalent pace to the longer circuits. I maintained detailed documentation of visual observations and objective instrument readings at multiple locations each day. I noted the time of day, weather conditions, elevation, and subjective distance perception accuracy for each observation point. By the end of the Shining Creek patrol on October 21, I had collected approximately 30 paired observations, objective GPS/compass data paired with subjective distance perception estimates. The data suggested a weak correlation between elevation and depth perception distortion, higher elevations showing slightly greater distortion, but no clear correlation with time of day or weather conditions. I returned to the ranger station on October 21 with another normal official report and continued personal documentation of my observations. In the following weeks, I requested additional patrol assignments. I volunteered for extra work, extending my normal monthly patrol hours beyond the standard routine. Tom asked me if there was a specific reason for the increased interest in patrol work. I told him I enjoyed the backcountry and wanted to increase my professional competency through additional field experience. This was not entirely false. I was, in fact, becoming increasingly engaged with understanding my own perceptual distortions through systematic observation in the field. Between October 22 and November 15, I completed 4 additional patrols in various sectors of the Pisgah National Forest. Each patrol included systematic observation of visual depth perception versus GPS-verified position. The data I collected suggested several patterns. 1. The distortion was indeed consistently present during backcountry patrols, affecting all sectors of the forest. 2. The distortion was specifically related to distance perception at moderate to far distances, beyond approximately 200 meters. 3. The distortion did not affect my ability to navigate, which remained accurate when relying on GPS and compass. 4. The distortion became more pronounced as fatigue accumulated over multiple days in the field. 5. The distortion varied in magnitude, sometimes subtle, sometimes more pronounced, but was consistently present. The most striking finding was this. When I returned to normal civilization, my apartment, the ranger station, the small town, the distortion entirely disappeared. My visual perception of distance in normal environments was accurate and reliable. The distortion was specific to the forest environment during extended field patrols. By mid-November, I had developed a working hypothesis. My visual system was producing depth perception distortions specifically triggered by the forest environment, likely due to some combination of factors including visual processing limitations in complex natural canopy environments, psychological effects of isolation, or subtle neurological effects of extended altitude/exertion exposure. This hypothesis was testable. If true, it suggested that I would stop experiencing the distortion if I stopped conducting extended forest patrols. But I did not stop conducting the patrols. Instead, I continued requesting additional assignments, and I continued systematic documentation of the distortions. By late November, Tom approached me about the pattern of my patrol requests. "You're logging a lot of field time," he said, "significantly above what your position requires. Is there something you're investigating?" I considered whether to disclose my observations about the depth perception distortions. The logical reasons not to disclose were significant. Any report of perceptual distortions during fieldwork would trigger concern about my fitness for duty, would likely lead to medical evaluation, and could result in restriction from fieldwork. But there was also something else at play. Some part of me wanted to continue collecting data. Some part of me was engaged with understanding these distortions not as a problem to be solved or eliminated, but as a phenomenon to be observed and documented. I'm assessing field conditions pretty thoroughly, I told Tom. Some trail integrity issues I want to monitor. This was also not entirely false. My increased patrol frequency was allowing me to track seasonal changes in trail conditions. Tom seemed to accept this explanation, though I sensed some lingering uncertainty in his response. Okay, just make sure you're taking adequate rest time. The burnout rate for rangers who overwork in the field is higher than the administrative side. I assured him I was maintaining adequate rest and recovery time. Between mid-November and early December, I experienced a shift in my relationship to the observations. During the earlier patrols, I had been trying to understand the distortions to determine whether they were real in some meaningful sense, or whether they were products of fatigue and psychological stress. I had been attempting to decide whether to report them, to seek medical evaluation, or to try to eliminate them through behavioral changes. But by December, I had stopped trying to make that determination. Instead, I had begun to accept the distortions as simply being part of my perceptual experience during fieldwork. The distortions were present. The instruments remained accurate. I remained able to navigate and function. There was no clear resolution needed. The distortions became, in a sense, something I observed alongside all my other observations. The color of the leaves, the quality of the light, the sounds of the forest, the ache in my legs, and the systematic compression of visual depth perception. I continued patrol work through December, maintaining my systematic documentation of observations. The data I collected in December was consistent with the data from previous months. Distance perception distortions, ranging from subtle to pronounced, but consistently correlated with time spent in the forest environment. By late December, I had collected approximately 80 paired observations across multiple patrols in multiple sectors. The patterns in the data were clear and consistent. On December 27th, I requested a meeting with Tom to discuss my patrol assignments. I've been thinking about my work, I said. I'd like to transition to more backcountry-based positioning. Possibly a fire lookout assignment or a seasonal backcountry ranger position. I'm more interested in extended field work than in the office-based coordinator role. Tom looked surprised by this request. My position at the ranger station was primarily administrative coordination, which is typically considered a higher status position than the backcountry ranger roles. You'd be taking a pay cut and losing the office-based benefits, Tom said. Are you sure about this? I'm more interested in the field work, I said. I think that's where my interest actually lies. Tom agreed to explore the possibility of restructuring my position toward more extended backcountry patrol work, possibly including a seasonal lookout tower position. It would take a few weeks to arrange given budget and staffing, Tom said, but I can start looking into it. The year changed. January arrived. The forest became cold and bare as winter deepened. On January 12, I completed what I planned to be my final systematic observation patrol using the detailed data collection methodology I had developed. The patrol was in the Pisgah sector, returning to the area where I had first experienced the perceptual distortions. I retraced portions of the route from my initial September patrol. The terrain appeared entirely normal. The trail was stable. The shelter structures were unchanged, but the distortions were still present. The depth perception compression, the visual field compression, the unstable sense of distance. I documented the observations one final time. 17 paired measurements of objective position and subjective distance perception across the 4-day patrol. The data was consistent with all previous observations. At the final observation point on January 14, while standing at an overlook with clear views toward distant ridgelines, I recorded a final note in my ranger notebook. 4 months and 15 days of systematic observation, approximately 100 paired measurements, objective finding, visual depth perception distortion specific to forest environment during extended fieldwork. Subjective finding, distortion is consistent, non-debilitating, and appears to be stable pattern rather than degrading phenomenon. No clear explanation, no medical concern, no functional impairment. Continuing with increased backcountry assignment as planned. Final monitoring note completed January 14. Future observations will not be systematically documented, will proceed as normal field ranger operations. I then erased all of the detailed observation data from my ranger notebook, carefully removing the pages and destroying them so that no written record of the systematic observations would remain. The official reports from my September through January patrols contained no mention of the distortions. They were straightforward documentation of trail conditions, maintenance items, and routine observations. My personal internal understanding of the distortions would remain unshared and undocumented. By mid-January, Tom had arranged for my transition to a new position. Starting February 1, I would be assigned to a combination of extended backcountry patrols and a seasonal position at the Northridge Fire Lookout Tower. The Fire Lookout Tower assignment would provide continuous presence in a remote location for up to 2 months during the fire season. The tower sits at elevation 6,200 feet, providing views across 40 to 50 miles of terrain in clear weather. I accepted the position without hesitation. On February 2, I was stationed at the Northridge Tower. The structure is a traditional fire lookout design. A small enclosed cabin at the top of a steel tower, with windows on all sides providing 360-degree visibility. The tower is accessed by a 2-mile trail from the nearest parking area. Supplies are delivered approximately weekly via the same trail. I settled into the tower routine relatively quickly. The daily work involves tracking weather conditions, scanning the horizon for signs of fire, logging observations, and maintaining equipment. The tower is equipped with radio communication to the ranger station and to other towers in the network. I was living and working at 6,200 feet elevation, spending all my time in the tower or in the immediate surrounding area. The isolation was absolute. The view was expansive, and from the moment I arrived at the tower, the visual distortions I had been observing for the previous 4 months became dramatically more pronounced. The distortion at the tower manifested as a clear and consistent visual field compression. The landscape that should extend 40 to 50 miles in clear weather appeared to extend only 15 to 20 miles. The distant ridgelines appeared compressed as though viewed through an optical lens that was reducing apparent distance. This compression was consistent and stable. It did not fluctuate wildly, but it was clearly wrong. Dramatically enough that anyone visiting the tower and comparing the view to the map would immediately recognize the perceptual error. But nobody was visiting the tower. The tower is isolated, accessed by a single trail. Visitor access is restricted. During fire season, the tower is staffed by a single ranger, me, with no routine visitation except for supply delivery personnel who came every 7 to 10 days with food and equipment. So the visual distortion, while dramatic, was not causing any immediate problem. I could see fires if they occurred. The compressed view still showed enough detail to identify smoke at distance. The functional purpose of the tower, fire detection, was not impaired. What was changed was my awareness of my own perceptual system. For the first 4 months, the distortions had been subtle. A slight compression of depth here, a minor shifting of distance perception there. Observing them had required systematic attention and comparison of visual perception against instrument data. But at the tower, the distortion was obvious and persistent. There was no ambiguity about it. I was seeing the landscape differently than the map indicated it should appear. The discrepancy was clear. I began to spend time each day simply observing the landscape, watching how it appeared at different times of day and under different weather conditions. In early morning, the view was sometimes clearer. By afternoon, atmospheric conditions created additional visual effects. In clear weather, I could see the distortion shape, a kind of compression of the entire visual field, as though the landscape were being viewed through a slightly curved lens. I did not report the distortion to the ranger station. I did not mention it to the supply delivery personnel who came weekly. I continued my routine fire watch duties as though nothing unusual was occurring. By mid-February, I had begun to wonder whether the distortion was actually perceptual, meaning occurring in my visual processing system, or whether it was something about the tower itself, or about my position in the tower, that was affecting my perception. I conducted a simple test. I went down the 2-mile trail from the tower to the parking area and looked back at the tower from that lower elevation. From the parking area, looking back toward the tower location, the distant ridges appeared to be at their normal apparent distance. The landscape view was normal. I then returned to the tower and looked out from the tower cab. The compression returned. This suggested the distortion was specifically related to elevation or position in the tower. not a general alteration of my visual system, but the exact mechanism remained unclear. I continued observing the phenomenon without attempting to understand it further. By late February, another change occurred. I began hearing sounds in the tower that could not be accounted for by normal environmental sources. The first occurrence was a repetitive tapping sound that I heard at approximately 2 a.m. on February 23. The sound was irregular but purposeful. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause, tap. Coming from somewhere outside the tower but distinct enough to be clearly audible through the tower's walls. I checked the tower exterior using a flashlight, looking for any animals or objects that might be producing the sound. Nothing was visible. The surrounding forest was dark and quiet. The tapping continued intermittently for approximately 30 minutes and then ceased. Similar sounds continued on subsequent nights. Tapping, knocking, or distant voices. Sounds that were clearly audible when I attended to them, but for which I could find no visible source. These sounds were similar to the sounds I had heard during my initial September patrol. The knock in the night, the voices without visible speakers, but now they were occurring at a location where I had complete visibility and isolation. There was no possibility of another person being in the area. There was no trail access other than the marked trail, which I would have heard if anyone approached. Yet the sounds continued. I did not report these sounds to the ranger station. I did not mention them to supply delivery personnel. I simply noted them in my personal observations and continued my tower duties. By mid-March, the sounds had become almost routine. Expected occurrences during evening and night hours ranging from tapping to distant voices to sounds that were almost like music but not quite coherent enough to identify as music. I was maintaining my fire watch duties effectively. I was logging observations accurately. I was communicating properly via radio with the ranger station, but I was also existing in a state of continuous awareness of sounds that I could not explain, and a visual distortion that was obvious and persistent. The fire season progressed through March and into April. The temperature warmed. The forest began the transition into spring. My response to the visual distortions and the inexplicable sounds had evolved into something I might describe as acceptance. The distortions were there. The sounds occurred. These were simply part of my experience in the tower. The way the weather was part of my experience. The way the view of the landscape was part of my experience. I was not frightened or distressed. I was functioning effectively in my role. I was simply aware of these additional phenomena that were present in my consciousness. On April 10th, I received a radio communication from Tom. A routine supply delivery had been scheduled, but the supply personnel had become ill and the delivery would need to be delayed by several days. "You'll be fine for a week without resupply?" Tom asked. I reviewed my supplies. I had adequate food and water for at least 10 days. No resupply was urgently needed. "No problem," I replied. "I'm well stocked." "Good. The personnel should be back by midweek next week. I'll send them out then." The radio communication ended. The week of extended isolation did not markedly change my experience. The sounds continued. The visual distortion persisted. I maintained my observation duties, but on April 15, when the supply personnel arrived, I experienced something new. The supply personnel, a rotating volunteer who comes to the tower weekly, was named Robert. He had been the supply runner for approximately 3 weeks. On April 15th, Robert arrived with weekly supplies as expected, but Robert had no memory of the previous 3 weeks. "First time to this tower," Robert said when he arrived. "Where do you want these supplies?" I pointed Robert toward the supply storage area, and he began offloading the supplies. "You've been here before," I said. "You've been doing the supply run for 3 weeks." Robert looked confused. "No, this is my first assignment to this tower. I've done runs to the Cathedral Tower and the Shining Rock Tower, but this is my first time to North Ridge." I felt something shift in my understanding of the situation, though I could not articulate what the shift was. "Right, of course," I said. "I'm sorry, I'm confusing this with someone else." Robert completed the supply delivery and left. I did not mention the confusion about whether he had been here before, but the exchange stayed with me. If Robert's memory was accurate, and there was no reason to believe it was not, then the person who had delivered supplies to the tower for the previous 3 weeks was not Robert. It was someone else, someone who had not previously existed in the rotating supply personnel. But I had interacted with supply deliveries for 3 weeks. I had seen a person. I had conversed with them. The supplies had been delivered, yet now there was no record of this person in the official supply rotation. By late April, the fire season was ending. The temperature had warmed to the point where fire risk was decreasing. The tower staffing was transitioning toward the seasonal closing. I had now been at the tower for approximately 3 months. The visual distortion had remained constant throughout. The sounds had continued, becoming almost predictable in their occurrence patterns. I had made observations that were difficult to reconcile with normal explanation. The supplier who did not exist. The perceptual distortions that had progressed from subtle to obvious. The sounds that had no visible source. But I had also continued functioning effectively. My fire watch duties had been performed accurately. My communications with the ranger station had been proper and professional. No actual fire had occurred, so my perceptual issues had not affected my ability to fulfill the primary purpose of the tower position. On April 28th, Tom contacted me via radio to discuss the end of my tower assignment. "You'll be transitioning out of the tower by mid-May," Tom said. "We're ramping down seasonal staffing. You'll go back to rotating patrol assignments for the summer." I acknowledged the information. "How was the tower assignment?" Tom asked. "Are you satisfied with the position?" I paused before responding. The question offered me an opportunity to disclose the perceptual distortions, the sounds, the strange encounter with the supply person who had no memory of previous visits, but I did not disclose any of this. "It was good," I said. "Good to have the extended assignment in one location. Good experience. Any issues with the equipment? Any problems we should address for next season?" "Equipment is functioning well. No issues." "All right. I'll have transport arranged for May 15. We'll get you back to regular patrol rotation." The radio communication ended. I spent the remaining weeks at the tower continuing my routine duties, watching the visual distortion that remained constant, listening to the sounds that continued to occur without identifiable source. On May 15, I left the North Ridge Tower, descending the 2-mile trail to the parking area and returning to the ranger station. The visual distortion disappeared once I was back at the ranger station. My perception of distance returned to normal. The landscape appeared to be the correct apparent distance, but the sounds, oddly, did not immediately disappear. For several days after leaving the tower, I continued to perceive the tapping and knocking sounds without identifiable source, now occurring in my apartment and at the ranger station. By May 20, approximately 5 days after leaving the tower, the sounds had ceased. My environment had returned to normal in all perceptual dimensions. It is now June 18, approximately 1 month since I left the tower assignment. I have returned to my normal rotating patrol schedule, covering various sectors of the Pisgah National Forest. I have not experienced the perceptual distortions on the patrol assignment since returning from the tower. My visual perception of distance is normal. I navigate accurately, and my perception aligns with my instruments and maps, but I remain aware that the distortions occurred. During the sustained tower assignment and during the extended fall and winter patrol period, I experienced clear and persistent perceptual phenomena that did not match objective reality. I have documented some of this experience in notes that I have kept privately. I have not reported any of the perceptual issues to the ranger station. I have not sought medical evaluation. Tom has asked, informally, how I am adjusting to the return to patrol assignments. I told him I am adjusting well. He has not expressed any concern about my performance or my mental state. The supply delivery discrepancy from April. The person who had delivered supplies for 3 weeks but had no memory of doing so, and no record in the official rotation, remains unexplained in my mind. I have considered multiple explanations for this and for the other phenomena. The most consistent explanation is that I experienced a series of perceptual distortions and/or psychological effects triggered by extended isolation and/or altitude exposure and/or accumulated fatigue. These effects resolved once I returned to normal living conditions. The alternative explanations that something actually changed in the environment, that my perception was accurate but revealed something unusual about reality, that the supply person's memory gap was a genuine anomaly rather than my confusion, remain possible but unconfirmed. I have chosen not to investigate further or attempt to clarify these questions. I have chosen to integrate these experiences into my understanding of my own capabilities and limitations, and to proceed with my work as a ranger. I remain uncertain about many aspects of what I experienced. That uncertainty is not comfortable. but it is for now something I am accepting. I continue to return to the forest, to conduct my patrol duties, to observe the landscape around me. The distortions do not return. The sounds do not recur. The environment appears normal in all measurable ways, but I remain aware of having experienced something that I cannot fully explain, in a place that remains otherwise familiar and, in all practical terms, unchanged. This is where I leave the documentation, not with answers, but with the awareness that some experiences remain, even after careful observation and analysis, persistently unclear. My name is Marcus David Reed. I am 47 years old, and I have worked as a backcountry ranger for the Monongahela National Forest for 23 years. This is my first season covering the extended Highlands region, the uppermost sections of the Cranberry Wilderness, the Roaring Plains, and the access routes connecting them. The assignment came through in March. My previous posting, the Lower Greenbrier Drainage, had become routine. 16 seasons there, I knew every switchback, every fire road, every potential emergency shelter. The supervisors suggested a rotation, new terrain, new challenges, new responsibility. I arrived at the Hillman Highway Ranger Station on April 14th at A0643 hours. Weather was clear, temperature approximately 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Station logs indicated no unusual activity over the winter. 3 hikers had requested permits for the Highland Trail section. 2 overnight groups, 1-day passage, all documentation standard. The inventory checked out, equipment was properly maintained. The radio tower at Brickhouse Ridge was functioning at normal strength. I ran a full communications test at A077, station to ridge came through at full strength. Ridge to base came through clear. My assignment was straightforward. Conduct a complete perimeter patrol of the Roaring Plains sector, moving between the established ranger cabins at Grindstone Ridge and the emergency shelter at Collinsworth Gap. The route covers approximately 18 miles of marked trail and fire road. At my pace, accounting for maintenance checks and standard observation procedures, the circuit takes 4 days round trip. The terrain rises from approximately 2,400 feet at the station base to a ridge elevation of 3,680 feet at the Roaring Plains summit. Dense rhododendron thickets dominate the valleys. Oak and red spruce cover the higher elevations. I packed standard equipment. Backpack weight at departure was 32 pounds. GPS unit. Topographic maps. Radio with fresh batteries. First aid kit. Compass. Fire starting materials. 2 days of field rations. Water filtration tablets. Emergency blanket. Multi-tool. Notebook. Pen. Flashlight. Headlamp. Thermometer. Weather log sheets, all sealed in waterproof compartments. My boots were recently resoled. My socks were new merino blend. Blisters would not be a factor. I departed the station at 0825 hours on April 14th. Clear sky, light southwest wind. The forecast called for a warming trend moving into the afternoon. I followed the fire road north toward Cranberry Run, the primary entry point for the Roaring Plains circuit. The road surface was recently maintained. Spring runoff had scoured some sections, but passage remained straightforward. I made notes on trail conditions as I walked: erosion patterns, gravel distribution, vegetation encroachment, standard observation protocol. At 11:10 hours, I reached the Cranberry Run Junction. This is the point where the fire road becomes footpath. I stopped to verify my position on the map. GPS coordinates read 38.6847 north, 80.2193 west. This matched the marked location. The stone cairn indicating the path junction was present and in good condition. I ate a partial lunch here: cheese, nuts, jerky. I drank approximately 16 ounces of water. Temperature was now approximately 48 degrees. The light was clear, long shadows stretched eastward from the ridgeline. I resumed movement into the Cranberry Run Valley at 11:45 hours. This section of trail is narrow and descends steeply through dense rhododendron. The slope angle is approximately 32 degrees. The path has been cut into the mountain repeatedly over decades, creating a trough effect. Loose shale is common. Exposed roots provide irregular footing. The forest here is old growth. Red spruce trees exceed 2 feet in diameter. The canopy at this elevation is sparse, nothing blocks the sky yet. In another month, the rhododendron would be even more oppressive, blocking light almost completely. I heard water from Cranberry Run approximately 0.3 miles before I reached the creek crossing. The sound was substantial, heavy winter snowmelt still moving through the upper basins. When I arrived at the crossing, the water was running perhaps 3 feet wide and 18 inches deep. The current was swift. I checked my map. The recorded depth at normal flow was approximately 10 inches. This suggested significant water volume from recent weather. I documented this in my notebook. Time, 1:12:47 hours. Condition, high flow, likely post-storm runoff. No recent precipitation in this immediate area. Passage remains safe with proper foot placement. I used my hiking pole for stability and crossed without difficulty. By 1400 hours, I had moved to higher elevation. The trail emerged from the rhododendron thicket and entered spruce oak transition forest. The air temperature was noticeably cooler. I estimated approximately 42 degrees now. The sky remained clear, but I observed cloud development to the west. The radio crackled with weather service updates from the Brickhouse Ridge Tower. Nothing unusual reported. Standard evening weather forecast. Low pressure system moving in late tomorrow afternoon. I established my first night camp at 16:30 hours in a cleared area approximately 0.8 miles southeast of Grindstone Ridge Cabin. This location is not the cabin itself, but rather an established camping area used by maintenance crews during trail work. The clearing is approximately 200 feet in diameter, flat ground, surrounded by young hemlocks. A fire ring exists here from previous use. Water source is a small seep approximately 150 feet to the north. I had walked approximately 8.2 miles from the station. My legs were fresh. My feet were dry. No physical issues whatsoever. I prepared camp using standard procedure. Removed backpack, set up tent away from fire ring, collected deadfall wood, prepared the fire pit, filtered water into containers, completed these tasks by 1715 hours. The sun had not yet set but was clearly in decline. The light was shifting from white to gold, and the shadows were lengthening dramatically. I made dinner instant rice with dried vegetables, drank approximately 24 ounces of water, sat in the clearing for approximately 30 minutes as the light continued to fade. At 17:45 hours, I documented the day in my notebook. Date, temperature log, elevation markers, trail conditions, wildlife observations, weather patterns. I had observed 2 red-tailed hawks, tracks from a black bear cub approximately 1 week old. No deer sightings, which was unusual for this time of year. Standard for spring migration. I made note of the high water flow in Cranberry Run. I then attempted radio contact with the Hillman Highway Station. Transmission went out at 18:02 hours. Standard format. My name, location, current status, expected movement, no issues reported. The response came back immediately, clear and strong. My supervisor, James Garrett, confirmed receipt. Weather update, confirmation of my camp location on the map. All protocols acknowledged. Reception was excellent, no static, no dropped words, perfect clarity. We confirmed another radio check-in for the next evening at approximately the same time. The conversation lasted fewer than 2 minutes. Professional, routine, exactly as expected. I settled into the tent at approximately 18:30 hours. Darkness had arrived at full strength. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to the forest around me. Wind moved through the spruce. The creek sound was very distant, barely audible. Branch movement, small animals moving through underbrush, the normal sounds of a mountain forest at night. Sleep came easily. I had walked a substantial distance at a good pace. My body was appropriately tired. My mind was calm and clear. I woke at 05:30 hours. Natural wake-up, no alarm required. The sun was not yet visible, but the eastern sky was beginning to show the first signs of lighter gray. Temperature inside the tent was approximately 38 degrees. Outside, I could see my breath as vapor when I emerged. The forest was still heavily in shadow. My thermometer recorded the outside air as 34 degrees Fahrenheit. I began camp routine. Built a fire, heated water, made coffee, ate breakfast, oatmeal with dried fruit, consumed approximately 16 ounces of water. This entire process took until 6:15 hours. By then, visible light was increasing. The cloud development I had observed the previous evening had not materialized. The sky was clear. Wind direction had shifted to the north. This was consistent with the Weather Service forecast. A high-pressure system was still in control. The low-pressure system would arrive later today or tonight. I broke camp at 06:45 hours. Tent packed, fire ring thoroughly extinguished and cleaned. Campsite left exactly as I had found it. No trace of my presence. Standard leave no trace procedure. My backpack was now loaded with 6 days of supplies instead of the original 2 days because I was beginning the main patrol loop. The weight was approximately 28 pounds. I had consumed enough supplies that my pack was actually slightly lighter despite adding field rations. The route today would take me from this camp area to Grindstone Ridge Cabin, approximately 8 miles north, and then to establish myself at that cabin for the remainder of the day while I conducted trail maintenance work on the Roaring Plains approach routes. The weather was favorable. I expected clear conditions all day, with possible cloud development only in the evening hours. I reached Grindstone Ridge Cabin at 07:35 hours. This is a permanent ranger shelter approximately 12 feet by 16 feet, built in 1987 and maintained annually. The structure is sound, roof is intact, windows are secured, door was locked as expected. I used my key to open it. Interior was dry and clean. Previous ranger had left it in good order. Standard supplies were present: kerosene lamp, matches, backup flashlights, first aid supplies, emergency water containers, and a logbook. I reviewed the logbook. No entries since the previous ranger's October visit. The seasonal rotation means this cabin sits unoccupied for approximately 6 months during winter. Standard notation indicated that supervisory staff would conduct a spring inspection sometime in May. I made my own entry: date, time, my name, purpose of visit, current conditions, projected next visit. I recorded the time as 0748 hours. I noted that everything was in proper condition. I spent the next 4 hours conducting trail maintenance work on the routes leading into the Roaring Plains sector. This involved clearing minor brush from the primary trails, checking blazes on trees, verifying that trail markers were visible and properly spaced, and removing any significant deadfall that had accumulated over winter. This is routine maintenance. A trail needs to be passable but does not require constant grooming. A few fallen branches are acceptable, but a truly hazardous situation, a large tree blocking passage, heavy brush encroachment that makes the path difficult to follow, these require attention. By 11:30 hours, I had completed work on the main approach trail. I returned to the cabin for lunch. Temperature outside was now approximately 52 degrees. The day had warmed considerably. Wind remained light from the north. I ate lunch at 11:45 hours in the cabin's interior. Sandwiches, nuts, 1 energy bar, 20 ounces of water. I sat in a chair inside the cabin and made detailed notes on the maintenance work I had completed, specific locations, exact distances along the trail from known markers, observations about vegetation status, soil conditions, and erosion patterns. At 12:30 hours, I prepared to conduct a secondary check on the Ridge Access Fire Road. This road ascends from the cabin area northwestward to the Roaring Plains summit, reaching approximately 3,680 feet elevation. The road is passable by vehicle, though the surface condition dictates that only light trucks or four-wheel drive vehicles should attempt it, and only in favorable seasons. Winter snowfall makes it impassable. Late spring, like now, is usually appropriate for inspection. I did not take the full backpack. Instead, I carried a smaller day pack with essential equipment: water, snacks, GPS unit, maps, radio, compass, and my notebook. The larger pack remained at the cabin. This is standard procedure for day excursions when base camp is established. I locked the cabin at 12:35 hours. The fire road ascends steeply. The first section rises approximately 1,1200 feet over a distance of roughly 2.3 miles. The road surface is gravel and packed earth, badly rutted in places from water runoff. At several points, I observed erosion gullies that would require attention before the road could be safely used by vehicle traffic. I documented these locations: GPS coordinates, estimates of repair work required, estimated gravel needed. At 14:20 hours, I reached the midpoint of the road ascent. I stopped here to check my position. My GPS read 38.7032 north, 80.2447 west. This was slightly west of what I expected based on my map reading. The discrepancy was minor, perhaps 0.1 miles west of calculated position. This is well within normal GPS accuracy. I adjusted my mental map slightly. Wind at this elevation was more substantial. I could see westward across 3 valleys now. Distant ridges were clearly visible. The sky was still clear, but I observed the cloud development accelerating. A thick system was building to the west. The weather service forecast of afternoon cloud development appeared accurate. I continued upward. The vegetation here was predominantly mountain laurel and scattered red spruce. The undergrowth was thick. In another few weeks, once the plants achieved full spring growth, this area would be nearly impenetrable away from the road. Now in mid-April, the vegetation was still relatively open. I could see significant distances into the forest. At 1540 hours, I reached the Roaring Plains summit. This is approximately 3,680 feet elevation. The clearing here is substantial. The elevation gain from the cabin was approximately 1,280 feet. A fire observation tower once stood at this location, though it was decommissioned in 1992. Only the concrete foundation remains. The view from here is extensive. I could see northward across the Roaring Plains to the distant peaks of the Highland system. Southward, I could see back down toward Cranberry Valley and the ridges that formed its eastern border. I sat here for approximately 20 minutes and made detailed observations of the vista. Wind direction had shifted. It now came from the northwest with considerable force. The clouds to the west had developed significantly. What had been dispersed cloud cover was now a substantial system with dark bases visible. The cloud heights suggested moisture and instability aloft. Rain was likely within the next few hours. This was consistent with forecasts of a developing low-pressure system. I used my camera to take photographs of the fire road conditions at the summit. These photographs would be part of my formal report documenting the road's condition and required maintenance. I then began my descent at 1606.05 hours. The return journey took longer than the ascent because I was now moving downhill on a steep, rutted surface. Foot placement required constant attention. I had to manage the backward lean of descent to avoid jarring my knees excessively. By 1730 hours, I had returned to Grindstone Ridge Cabin. I entered the cabin at 1732 hours. The interior was beginning to darken because the sun had descended in the west and cloud cover was now completely obscuring the sky. I used the kerosene lamp and one of the backup flashlights to see clearly. I unpacked my day pack, reviewed my notes from the fire road inspection, made a detailed entry in the cabin logbook documenting the maintenance assessment and road conditions. I noted the time at 1756 hours. The temperature outside was now approximately 44 degrees. Wind was increasing noticeably. Trees around the cabin were beginning to move substantially. The first drops of rain began to fall at approximately 1815 hours. Light initially, but the volume increased steadily. By 1845 hours, a moderate rain was falling. The kind of rain that comes with a steadily developing weather system. I prepared dinner. The cabin has a wood stove, though I did not light it because the cabin temperature was reasonable and the rain was not severe enough to create significant interior cooling. I used a camping stove inside, placing it carefully on the table and maintaining proper ventilation. Dinner was rice and canned vegetables, 24 ounces of water. I consumed this meal at approximately 1900 hours. At 1920 hours, I attempted radio contact with the Hillman Highway Station. The scheduled check-in time was approximately this time. I pressed the transmission button on my radio. Static came back, no response. I waited. Tried again at 1925 hours. Static and dead silence. No response from the base station. This was unusual but not alarming. Radio reception in mountain valleys is variable. The weather was worsening, which could affect transmission. The fact that I had good reception at the Cranberry Run summit suggested the valley at Grindstone Ridge might have interference issues. I would attempt again later. This was not a crisis. I had food, shelter, and the weather, while worsening, was not severe enough to represent a genuine emergency situation. I sat inside the cabin reading my own field notes and reviewing my topographic maps. I verified my understanding of the terrain I had covered. I plotted tomorrow's route on the map in detail, marking waypoints and identifying potential obstacles. This is routine pre-patrol preparation. By 2015 hours, I felt confident about my tomorrow's route. I retired to sleep on a cot in the cabin, which was considerably more comfortable than my tent. The cabin walls blocked the wind sound. The roof did not rattle. I fell asleep quickly. Rain continued throughout the night. I woke at 05:45 hours to the steady sound of water moving across the roof. The cabin interior was noticeably darker than the previous morning because the cloud cover was complete. I estimated that approximately 2 to 3 inches of rain had fallen during the night. The sound of water in the gutters and dripping from the eaves was constant. I checked my watch. 05:48 hours. I lay in the cot for another 10 minutes listening to the rain before rising. The cabin temperature was approximately 42 degrees. My breath was visible. I used the camping stove again to heat water for coffee. Breakfast was instant oatmeal with dried berries. This morning I felt alert and rested. No physical complaints whatsoever. At 06:15 hours I attempted radio contact again with the station. Same result as the previous evening. Static, no response. This was now 2 missed check-ins. The protocol requires 3 missed check-ins before emergency procedures are triggered. This is standard. Single missed checks happen regularly in remote mountain work. Radio propagation is unreliable. Weather affects signals. The valley at Grindstone Ridge apparently had significant interference. I would attempt again this evening at the regular check-in time. I reviewed the plan for today. The route would take me from Grindstone Ridge Cabin eastward to the Collinsworth Gap Emergency Shelter. This is approximately 5.4 miles of trail distance, rising from approximately 3,200 feet elevation to approximately 3,400 feet at the gap, then descending slightly to the shelter at approximately 3,350 feet. The terrain here is more open than the Cranberry Valley section. The rhododendron is less dense. The forest is mixed oak and spruce. I packed my main backpack with supplies. Added extra food because the rainfall might make camp setup more difficult and I might want to establish a more comfortable shelter situation. Added rain gear. Checked my tent for any moisture seepage from last night. The tent had remained dry despite the heavy rain. Good workmanship in the setup and tent itself. I departed Grindstone Ridge Cabin at 0700 hours. The rain was still falling steadily, though perhaps slightly lighter than during the heaviest part of the night. The forest dripped constantly. Visibility was reduced to perhaps 400 feet due to the cloud and rain. The forest itself was very dark. My headlamp was visible even in the morning hours because the natural light was minimal. The trail eastward from the cabin begins with a gentle descent. For the first 0.5 miles, the path follows an old fire road that has become overgrown but still passable. Water was running across the road in several places where drainage was channeling flow. I noted the water volume was substantial but not unusual for heavy rainfall conditions. Fallen branches had accumulated in several sections. I moved these aside as I walked, using my hiking pole to lever them clear. At 0800 hours, I had moved approximately 1.2 miles from the cabin. My GPS position read 38.6987 north, 80.2089 west. This placed me precisely where I expected to be. The trail elevation was approximately 3,100 feet. Ahead, I could see the terrain rising slightly as the path climbed toward the Collinsworth Gap approach. The rain continued without change in intensity. I continued moving forward. The trail became narrower here and changed character from old fire road to cut path. The vegetation pressed more closely. At one point, a section of rhododendron tunnel required me to duck and move carefully through the brush. My pack pushed against the branches. The water from the leaves soaked my shoulders despite my rain gear. The darkness here was substantial. My headlamp provided the only illumination. At approximately 0930 hours, I became aware of a subtle change in the forest character. The change was difficult to articulate. The vegetation seemed denser than I expected from my map reading. The spacing of trees seemed tighter. The rhododendron was more substantial than my memory of this section from the trail description. This was not alarming. Rhododendrons are vigorous plants. Over years, they spread and create increasingly dense thickets. The trail itself was still passable. The blazes were visible. I had not lost orientation, but I noted this observation in my notebook. Time 0945 hours. Location approximately 3.1 miles from Grindstone Ridge Cabin. Elevation approximately 3,120 feet. Observation: vegetation density appears denser than expected from prior trail reports. Possible explanation: normal seasonal growth and multi-year spread of rhododendron coverage. The rain eased slightly at approximately 10:30 hours. The intensity diminished from steady medium rainfall to light drizzle. Visibility improved to perhaps 600 feet. The forest color shifted from very dark to merely dim. I could see more detail of the surrounding terrain now. The tree trunks were clearly visible. Small branches were distinct. At 1100 hours, I encountered what appeared to be a section of the trail that had been significantly washed out by recent water flow. This is not uncommon in mountain terrain after heavy rainfall. Water moving down slopes and along paths cuts deep gullies. The washout here was substantial. The trail had a erosion trench perhaps 4 feet deep and 3 feet wide. This represented significant water flow during or immediately after the rain. I stopped to assess the situation. The washout made the trail impassable in the direct line. However, the terrain on either side was passable. I could work my way around by moving slightly upslope and passing the erosion area laterally. This would add perhaps 200 feet to my route and require careful footing on steep terrain, but it was absolutely manageable. I took photographs of the washout, noted the location on my GPS, documented this in my notebook as a maintenance issue that would need to be addressed in the coming months. I then carefully moved around the eroded section. The slope was steep but not treacherous. My boots maintained good grip. I rejoined the trail approximately 400 feet downslope from the eroded area. By 1:45 hours, I had reached approximately 3.8 miles from Grindstone Ridge Cabin. My elevation was approximately 3,280 feet. The Collinsworth Gap shelter was now only about 1.6 miles ahead. The rain had stopped completely. The drizzle was now barely noticeable, more like mountain mist than actual rainfall. The cloud base remained very low. Visibility was still limited. Here something occurred that made me pause. I heard quite distinctly the sound of a voice, not clear enough to understand words, but definitely a human voice. It was distant. I estimate perhaps 300 to 400 feet away, somewhere upslope and to my left. The sound seemed to be a sustained vocalization, not a shout, but something like singing or sustained tonal speech. I stopped walking immediately, listened carefully. The sound continued for perhaps 3 seconds. Then it stopped. I heard only the forest sounds, dripping water, wind in the branches, the distant sound of water movement somewhere downslope. This was unexpected. According to my permit records, no other hikers were currently in the Roaring Plains sector. The trail to the south, down toward Cranberry Valley, should have no one. The northern approaches could theoretically have hikers, but the weather conditions were miserable. I would not expect anyone else out in this kind of weather. I attempted to determine the direction more precisely. The sound had come from my left, which would be north-northwest. I stood quietly for another 5 minutes, listening carefully. No further vocalizations, only forest sounds. The wind had picked up slightly, moving through the trees with a rushing sound that obscured details. Several possibilities occurred to me. Another ranger or maintenance worker that I was not aware of. A lost hiker. A group that had not registered properly. An animal, though I could not identify what animal would produce a vocalization that sounded distinctly human in character. The human voice would be the most straightforward explanation. A person calling out for some reason. The fact that I could not identify them was merely because of distance, terrain interference, and the sound dampening effect of the forest. I made a note of this in my notebook. Time, 1,048 hours. Location, approximately 3.8 miles from cabin. Elevation, 3,280 feet. Observation, heard vocalization that sounded distinctly human. Duration, approximately 3 seconds. Direction, estimated north-northwest. Distance estimated 300-400 feet. No response when I remained silent and listening. Possible explanation, another hiker or ranger, source unclear due to distance and terrain masking. I considered whether I should investigate. This would mean leaving the trail and moving into the forest toward the location where I estimated the sound originated. This would be potentially hazardous. The terrain was steep, visibility was limited, the forest was dense. Moving off trail in these conditions could easily result in getting lost or sustaining injury. And perhaps the most logical explanation was simply that another person was in the area. There was no indication of distress in the vocalization, no shouting, no calls for help. I decided to continue forward on the trail. I would mention the incident in tonight's radio check-in if I could establish contact. If there was a lost hiker or someone in trouble, that information would be useful to my supervisors. They could then investigate. I resumed walking at 11:55 hours. The remaining distance to Collinsworth Gap Shelter passed without further incident. The trail continued through dense forest. The elevation increased gradually. I crossed several small creek drainages where water was running swiftly due to the recent rainfall. One of these crossings required me to choose between jumping across or removing my boots and wading. I chose to wade. The water was approximately 18 inches deep and very cold. Once across, I wrung out my socks and continued walking. Wet feet would dry within an hour of walking. At 13:05 hours, I reached Collinsworth Gap. This is a natural gap in the ridge, a location where elevation drops slightly between two higher points. The shelter is a permanent structure similar to Grindstone Ridge Cabin but smaller, approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, built in 1994. The shelter provides basic protection from weather but is somewhat more exposed to wind due to the gap location. I approached the shelter cautiously. It was locked, as expected. I used my key to open the door. The interior was dry. The previous ranger had left it clean. Standard supplies were present. I made my entry in the logbook. Time, 13:15 hours. My name, date, current conditions. I noted that the trail had experienced significant washout damage approximately 2.2 miles southwest of this location, and that maintenance work would be required. I unpacked my main backpack inside the shelter. I did not set up my tent. The shelter itself would provide sufficient protection from the weather, which appeared to be clearing. The clouds were slightly higher now, still overcast, but the dense low-hanging cloud was breaking apart. Visibility was improving. I spent the remainder of the day conducting routine maintenance checks on trails in the immediate area around the shelter. There are 4 primary trails that branch from Collinsworth Gap. I conducted a full inspection of each, walking approximately 0.5 miles along each trail to verify blazes, check for deadfall, and assess vegetation status. This work took until approximately 1600 hours. By then, my legs were noticeably tired. I had walked approximately 9.2 miles today. I returned to the shelter and prepared dinner. Rice with dried meat, vegetables, consumed approximately 24 ounces of water. By 1700 hours, I was eating this meal inside the shelter. The clouds had continued to clear. Breaks were visible. Sunlight was visible intermittently through the clouds. The wind had become gusty, strong surges moving through the gap. At 17:45 hours, I attempted radio contact with the Hillman Highway Station. This was my 3rd scheduled check-in. Transmission went out at 17:47 hours. My standard report: location, status, no problems reported, planned movement tomorrow. I waited for response. The static came back. It was louder than before, more aggressive, more consistent. I waited through what seemed a full 10 seconds of heavy static. Then a voice broke through, but barely. I could hear my supervisor, James Garrett's voice, but perhaps only 60% of the words were intelligible. I could make out read, copy, and something about conditions. The signal was very poor. I transmitted again, acknowledged that I had received some of his transmission but requested him to repeat. Another long period of static. Then the voice came again, somewhat clearer. I could now understand most of his words. He confirmed my status, confirmed he would expect me to complete the circuit and return to Grindstone Ridge by April 18th. He mentioned the weather system. He was asking about my condition. I responded, confirmed everything, stated that I was fine, all systems nominal, trail conditions are manageable, no emergencies. I was about to mention the vocalization I had heard earlier when the static became completely overwhelming. The radio was just noise, no clarity at all. I waited. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds, then it cleared again, but I could not hear Garrett's voice anymore. I made one more transmission, confirmed that I was ending the check-in, confirmed that I would contact him again tomorrow evening at the regular time. I requested him to confirm my message. There was a pause, and then a response came through. The signal was better now. I could understand him clearly. He confirmed, said, "See you when you get back, Marcus. Conditions look uncertain." Then he signed off. I shut off the radio at 17:58 hours. Something about that radio exchange bothered me, though I could not immediately identify what. The static was worse than expected. The transmission quality was degraded. This could simply be weather-related. The low-pressure system moving in could affect radio propagation, but something about it felt wrong. The way the static behaved, the length of the interruption, the difficulty in establishing clear contact. I made a note in my notebook. Time, 100 hours. Radio check-in completed, though with poor quality transmission. Static interference severe. Possible causes, weather system, terrain interference, or equipment issue with radio or station transmitter. Noted that Supervisor James Garrett mentioned conditions appearing uncertain. This is consistent with weather forecast of low-pressure system development. I spent the remainder of the evening reviewing my maps and planning tomorrow's route. I would depart Collinsworth Gap at early morning and follow a circuit through the northern sections of the Roaring Plains, moving through terrain designated as the High Country sector. This is less traveled country, fewer established trails, more reliance on topographic navigation. The terrain is higher elevation, more exposed with better vistas. I plan to camp tomorrow evening at an established camping area approximately 8.4 miles from the shelter. I settled into sleep at approximately 2,000 hours inside the shelter. The wind continued to gust through the gap. The shelter walls moved slightly with each gust. Not alarming. The structure is designed to withstand significant wind. The movement is normal and expected. I fell asleep to the sound of wind and the distant sound of branches moving. I woke at 05:30 hours, again a natural wake-up. The wind had died down during the night. The sound inside the shelter was much quieter. I could hear the forest sounds much more clearly now. Dripping water. The rain had not fallen during the night, but water was still dripping from the shelter roof and trees. Wind in the branches. Something moving in the undergrowth downslope from the shelter. I rose and prepared morning routine. Coffee, oatmeal, 20 ounces of water. By 06:30 hours I had eaten and was preparing to depart. The sky outside was lighter now. The cloud cover was still present, but it was higher. The weather was clearing. The temperature was approximately 38 degrees. I packed my tent and sleeping bag, left the shelter in the same clean condition I had found it. Made my logbook entry. Time 0650 hours. Confirmed my planned route, northwestward through High Country sector, camping approximately 8.4 miles away. I estimated arrival at campsite approximately 1,500 hours, depending on terrain difficulty. I departed Collinsworth Gap at 0655 hours, heading northwest. The terrain immediately north and west of the shelter is more open than the Cranberry Valley sections. The rhododendron is less dominant. The forest transitions to higher elevation species, red spruce, Fraser fir, occasional balsam fir at the highest elevations. The trail I followed was less maintained than the primary Roaring Plains approaches. This is expected. High Country sector is visited less frequently. The trail is visible but not always obvious. Navigation required careful attention to the topographic map and compass verification. By 0800 hours, I had moved approximately 1.4 miles from the shelter. Elevation was approximately 3,520 feet. I was moving through a section of exposed ridgetop terrain. The trees here were smaller and more widely spaced than in the valleys. The wind had more dominance. I could see significant distances now through the clearing clouds. To the west, I could see several ridges stretching away toward more distant mountains. To the south, the terrain dropped away into the Roaring Plains Valley. The trail here became less distinct. I relied more on the compass and topographic map than on obvious trailblazes. I could see faint evidence of prior use, places where vegetation had been compressed by previous hikers, occasional rock arrangements that marked the path, but these were subtle. At approximately 0900 hours, something seemed incorrect. I stopped and reviewed my map position. I calculated my current location based on the ridgeline I could see to my south and the elevation I had climbed. According to my calculations, I should be at approximately 38.7165 north, 80.2398 west. I checked my GPS. The GPS read 38.7089 north, 80.2317 west. This was a discrepancy of approximately 0.6 miles. My topographic navigation placed me further north and west than my GPS indicated. I looked at my compass. Bearing I was following was 312 degrees, which was correct for northwest travel. The compass seemed to be working normally. I examined the GPS unit more carefully. The battery indicator showed approximately 60% charge remaining. The signal indicator showed acquisition of 5 satellites. This is a good satellite count. The accuracy estimate displayed on the screen was approximately 31 feet, which is normal accuracy for this unit. No obvious malfunction. I decided to trust the GPS. Topographic navigation has an inherent margin of error. GPS positioning is more precise, though not perfect. The discrepancy was not enormous. Perhaps I had misjudged the location of a ridge or terrain feature on my visual assessment. I adjusted my mental position. I would trust the GPS reading. I resumed movement at 0900 hours, moving in the correct compass direction. By 1050 hours, I had reached approximately 3.2 miles from Collinsworth Gap. The terrain here dropped into a small valley. A creek ran through this valley. This is marked on my map as Bryce Creek. I could see the water ahead. The plan was to follow a trail that descended into this valley, crossed Bryce Creek, and then climbed out on the opposite side, resuming the northwestern movement toward my camping area. I descended into the valley. The terrain became steeper. Trees became taller and more densely packed. The creek's sound became louder. By approximately 11:30 hours, I reached the creek crossing. The water volume was substantial. The creek was running perhaps 4 feet wide and approximately 24 inches deep. The current was swift. This was significantly higher than the depth shown on my topographic map, which indicated approximately 10 inches at normal flow. This was concerning. The depth would require careful wading. My feet would go underwater. The current was strong enough that I would need to use my hiking pole for balance and stability. The risk of slipping was significant. I evaluated whether to attempt to cross or to move upstream or downstream to find a better crossing point. The map did not show any bridges. My plan had been to cross directly at this location. I could move upstream, but that would add distance and time to my route. I could move downstream, but that would create the same problem. I decided to attempt the direct crossing. I selected what appeared to be the most stable location. The rocks on the bottom seemed firm. I removed my boots and socks, placed them in a waterproof compartment of my pack. I kept my hiking pole in hand. I entered the water at 1:32 hours. The cold was immediate and severe. The water was perhaps 40 degrees Fahrenheit, fed by snowmelt from higher elevations. I gasped at the shock. My feet immediately registered that the bottom was more slippery than I had anticipated. The rocks were slime-covered, the typical slimy coating of algae that grows on underwater rocks. My bare feet had poor purchase. I moved forward slowly, using the hiking pole as a crutch. Each step required deliberate foot placement. The water deepened. At the midpoint of the creek, the water was approximately 26 inches deep. The current pushed against my legs. My thighs were now underwater. The shock of the cold had abated slightly, but my legs were starting to feel numb. I was approximately 2/3 of the way across when my left foot slipped. My sole lost contact with the rock beneath. I lurched sideways. The hiking pole held most of my weight. My right leg caught position on a rock. I stabilized. My heart was racing. That moment of lost footing had created a brief panic response. The realization that I was in swift, cold water with a heavy backpack that would potentially drag me down if I fully submerged was a clear recognition of actual danger. I paused for several seconds, breathing deliberately, re-establishing my focus. I resumed movement, more carefully now. My left foot found position on a more stable rock. I completed the crossing in approximately 2 minutes. I exited the water at 1:30 and 135 hours. My feet were numb, my legs were cold. The water had soaked my pants up to my mid-thigh. I sat immediately on the creek bank and used a towel to dry my feet. I dried my legs as thoroughly as possible. I replaced my socks, which I had kept dry, and then my boots. Once properly dressed, I took a few minutes to restore my thermal regulation. I drank some water, ate a snack, did some light activity to help regain body heat. By 1:45 hours, I felt warm enough to resume movement. The crossing had been more hazardous than I had anticipated. The creek depth and current were both worse than the map suggested. This was valuable information for my report. The trail here would need to be flagged as potentially hazardous in high water conditions. I resumed climbing out of the Bryce Creek Valley at 11:50 hours. The ascent on the opposite side was steep. The elevation climbed approximately 600 feet over the next 1.3 miles. By 1300 hours, I had reached the ridgetop on the opposite side of the valley. The elevation was approximately 3,680 feet. I was back in the higher elevation zone with more exposed terrain and wider vistas. I stopped here to warm up further and to verify my position. I checked my GPS. The reading was 38.7284 north, 80.2564 west. I consulted my map. This position was correct relative to my planned route. The compass bearing I was following was still approximately 312 degrees. I was moving at a good pace despite the delay at the creek crossing. The planned camping area was approximately 4.8 miles ahead. I resumed movement at 1310 hours. The afternoon progressed steadily. The terrain continued northwestward, rising and falling with the ridge system. I passed through several small clearings where fire had previously burned. Young trees were growing in these areas. The vegetation was taller than in the ridgetop zones, but shorter than in the protected valleys. The wind at this elevation was constant. I could see considerable distances. At approximately 14:30 hours, I became aware of something unusual. I was hearing sounds that seemed inconsistent with the forest sounds I would expect. Specifically, I was hearing what seemed to be voices, not a clear human voice like the one I had heard the previous day, but rather something less distinct. Fragmented vocalizations. They seemed to be coming from multiple sources, from different directions. I stopped and listened carefully. The sounds stopped when I stood still and focused my attention on them. When I resumed walking, they seemed to start again. This pattern continued for several minutes. I would stop. Silence. I would walk. Vague sounds. The sounds seemed to come from the periphery of audibility, not clearly identifiable, not obviously human, but not obviously animal either. The most rational explanation was that I was experiencing some form of auditory illusion. My mind was perhaps interpreting the sounds of wind and leaves and distant water in such a way that they seemed to pattern into something that resembled voices. This is a documented phenomenon in isolated environments. The human brain attempts to find patterns, including speech patterns, in ambiguous sensory input. I made a note of this observation. Time, approximately 14:35 hours. Observation. Hearing fragmented sounds that seem to resemble voice-like quality. Duration. Intermittent over approximately 15 minutes. Quality, very unclear, possibly auditory illusion created by wind, water, and leaf sounds. Most likely explanation, isolation-related pattern recognition by auditory system. Noted that the sounds seemed to increase when I was actively moving forward, and seemed to diminish when I stood still and focused on them. I continued walking and the sounds gradually diminished. By 1500 hours, I was not hearing them anymore. At 1500 hours, I reached my planned camping area. This is a relatively flat clearing approximately 200 feet in diameter, surrounded by younger red spruce and balsam fir. It is at approximately 3,560 feet elevation. The location is marked on the map as High Country Camp 1. Water is available from a small seep approximately 200 feet to the east. This camping area is not heavily used. My expectations were that I would find it unoccupied. When I entered the clearing, I immediately noticed something unusual. The clearing was not unoccupied. There was a fire ring that had been used recently. The logs around the fire ring had been rearranged since my last visit to this area, which was 7 months ago. The evidence suggested that someone had used this campsite within the past few weeks. I examined the fire ring more carefully. There was ash inside it. The ash was relatively fresh. The color suggested that the fire had burned within perhaps the past 1 to 2 months. There were charred wood remnants. No evidence of trash or garbage. Whoever had used this site had left it reasonably clean. I looked for other evidence, tent stakes, foot tracks, anything that would indicate how long the person or persons had stayed. I found a piece of colorful fabric snagged on a branch approximately 15 feet from the fire ring. The fabric appeared to be part of a tent. The color and style were consistent with modern camping equipment. The age of the fabric was uncertain. It could have been there for months or for weeks. This was unexpected. The high country sector is seldom visited. This camping area is not heavily advertised. It is not on the main tourist trails. The fact that someone had camped here recently was surprising. There were several possibilities. Another ranger, a backcountry enthusiast who was off trail, a group that had become lost, or something else entirely. I made detailed notes of these observations. Time, 15:10 hours. Location, High Country Camp 1, approximately 3,560 feet elevation. Observation, evidence of recent camping activity. Fire ring recently used. Ash suggests burning within past 4-8 weeks. Fabric fragment on branch suggests tent use. No other significant evidence. Possible explanations, another ranger unknown to me, off-trail hikers, lost persons, or activity from previous season with evidence remaining. I did not feel alarmed. There was no evidence of distress, no sign of violence or emergency. This was simply evidence that someone else had been in this area, that was all. It was interesting, but not necessarily a reason for concern. I set up my tent at the normal location within the clearing, away from the fire ring. I kept my tent setup identical to the setup at Cranberry Run Camp. Back from the fire area, south-facing opening, adequate distance for safety. I collected deadfall wood and prepared the fire ring for the evening. I filtered water from the seep into my containers. By 1545 hours, I had completed camp preparation. I prepared dinner at 1600 hours, rice with dried meat and vegetables, 24 ounces of water. As I ate, I reviewed my maps for the next day's travel. Tomorrow I would complete the circuit back toward Grindstone Ridge Cabin, then return to the station. If I moved at a reasonable pace without delays, I could reach the station by afternoon on April 18th. I had therefore accomplished approximately 4 days of patrol work. The remaining time would be devoted to report writing and equipment maintenance. The evening light had shifted to deep gold as the sun descended in the west. The clear conditions from the previous day had resulted in a more visible sunset today. The sky was colored in shades of orange and red. The wind at this elevation was still substantial, but the gusts seemed less aggressive than during the night of April 15th. At 1745 hours, I attempted radio contact. I transmitted my daily status report. Location confirmed, status confirmed, no problems. Expecting to return to station April 18th. I waited for response. The static came back. For a moment I heard nothing but the usual hiss and crackle. Then James Garrett's voice came through, much clearer than the previous day. I could understand approximately 90% of what he was saying. He confirmed my status, stated that the weather system was intensifying, mentioned that there was a possibility of significant wind and precipitation over the next 24 to 36 hours. He asked for confirmation that I had adequate supplies and shelter for potential weather deterioration. I confirmed everything. Stated that I had shelter available and adequate supplies for an extended camp period if necessary. Stated that my equipment was in good condition. The conversation was brief and professional. He ended with confirmation that he would expect contact tomorrow evening at the same time, and that I should proceed with my planned route unless weather created a safety concern. I signed off at 1758 hours. The sky continued to darken. By 1830 hours, the sky was quite dark. The stars were becoming visible in the clear areas between clouds. The clouds themselves were reflecting some color, possible indication that another weather system was approaching from the west. I spent the evening in my tent, reviewing my notes and updating my documentation. I made detailed entries regarding the evidence of prior camping activity at this location. I noted my observations about the auditory experiences, the voice sounds, and the fragmented vocalizations. I recorded the crossing of Breeze Creek and the higher-than-expected water depth. By 2000 hours, I was settled into sleep. The tent walls moved occasionally when wind gusts passed over the clearing. The fire ring was extinguished and covered. The campsite was secure. My sleeping bag was warm. My mind was moderately alert but moving toward sleep. I drifted into unconsciousness at approximately 20-30 hours. I woke at 02:15 hours. The sound of wind had increased substantially. The tent was moving more noticeably now. The wind was coming in stronger gusts. I lay in the sleeping bag and listened to the sound. The movement was within acceptable parameters. The tent was designed to handle this level of wind. No danger of the tent being blown away or severely damaged, but I did not fall back to sleep. Instead, I lay awake listening to the wind move through the clearing. After approximately 15 minutes of lying in the dark, I became aware of something else. Under the sound of the wind, there were other sounds that seemed to be voices, not distinct, not clearly formed into words, but definitely sound-like patterns that resembled human vocalizations. I sat up in the tent. The sounds continued. They seemed to come from outside, from the forest surrounding the clearing. Multiple sources, different pitches, different tonal qualities. Some seemed closer. Some seemed more distant. The sounds would rise and fall with the wind, but were not entirely created by the wind. They had a quality that seemed independent of the wind noise. I listened for approximately 5 minutes. The sounds continued. They did not resolve into anything intelligible, but they maintained a character that seemed almost intentional. The rational part of my mind considered possibilities, the wind creating unusual tonal qualities through trees and terrain features, my auditory system, in the dark and with reduced visual input, interpreting ambiguous sounds as voices, exhaustion creating auditory illusions, sleep deprivation. Though I had slept adequately the previous night, I got out of the sleeping bag. I put on my boots. I opened the tent and emerged into the darkness. The wind was indeed substantial. I estimated approximately 20 to 25 mile per hour gusts with stronger surges occurring at intervals of 30 to 60 seconds. The air temperature was cold. I estimated approximately 36 degrees. The sky was completely overcast, no stars visible, no moon visible. The darkness was nearly complete except for the forest silhouettes against the slightly lighter sky. I used my headlamp to illuminate the clearing. The beam cut through the darkness, showing the immediate terrain. The fire ring, the perimeter trees, the path to the water source. Nothing was visibly moving. No animals, no people, nothing unusual. I turned off the headlamp to allow my eyes to adjust to the darkness. I stood in the clearing and listened carefully. The wind continued. The sound of branches moving, the tonal qualities that had seemed voice-like were less obvious now that I was outside and aware that I was listening for them. The wind was simply wind. The trees were simply moving trees. The sounds were what wind and trees made. But there was something else, something almost beneath the wind sounds, something rhythmic, almost like a percussion pattern, very faint. I could barely detect it. It seemed to come from the forest to the north, beyond the edge of the clearing. I listened more carefully. The pattern repeated. I would count 1, 2, 3, 4, pause. 1, 2, 3, 4, pause. Then it would stop. Then it would start again. This pattern was repeated 4 times over the course of approximately 2 minutes. This was not a natural forest sound. This was intentional. The pattern was too regular, too rhythmic, too clearly organized to be wind, trees, or water sounds. I stood in the darkness with my eyes and ears focused on the forest to the north. My heart rate had increased. I was no longer calm, I was alert. I was also beginning to experience something that I would classify as unease. I waited in the darkness for approximately 5 minutes more. The sound did not repeat. I returned to my tent at 0240 hours. I did not sleep again for the remainder of the night. I lay in the sleeping bag and listened to the wind. I made no further sounds. I made no further movements. I simply waited for the darkness to end and daylight to arrive. At approximately 0530 hours, the eastern sky began to show the first hints of lighter gray. The overcast cloud cover meant that the sunrise was not dramatic, but gradually the darkness became twilight, became dim gray light. By 0600 hours, I could see across the clearing clearly. I got up. I dressed completely. I packed my tent and sleeping bag immediately. I did not prepare breakfast. I did not prepare coffee. I simply packed my equipment and prepared to depart. By 0630 hours, I had the clearing completely packed. I made no entry in my logbook for this location. I had no logbook here. I simply loaded my pack and began moving. I departed High Country Camp 1 at 0635 hours, moving southeastward toward Grindstone Ridge Cabin. The day was cold and overcast. The wind had not diminished. The forest was still moving from the wind. I moved at a faster pace than I had moved on any previous day. I did not stop to document or observe details. I moved forward with focus on reaching the cabin area by evening. By 0930 hours, I had reached Bryce Creek again. The water level had risen further. The creek was now perhaps 5 feet wide and approximately 30 inches deep. The current was faster. The crossing would be more difficult. I waded across carefully. The shock of cold was less severe this time. Or perhaps I was less sensitive to cold due to my physical and mental state. I crossed without incident. By 1145 hours, I had moved approximately 6.8 miles. I was approaching the terrain that would lead to Collinsworth Gap Shelter. I had been moving for 5 hours without stopping beyond the necessary time for the creek crossing. My pace was approximately 1.4 miles per hour, which was faster than my normal day travel pace. At 1200 hours, I reached Collinsworth Gap Shelter. I was not planning to stop here. I wanted to reach Grindstone Ridge Cabin by evening, but I decided that I should verify my equipment and assess my condition. I entered the shelter. I checked the logbook. My previous entry was present. I made a new entry, date, time, observation, traveling more quickly today due to desire to complete circuit. No problems with equipment or physical condition. I did not mention the sounds I had heard during the night. I rested for 15 minutes inside the shelter. I drank water. I ate a snack. I reviewed my route. From Collinsworth Gap to Grindstone Ridge was approximately 5.4 miles on the Western Trail. This was the trail I had traveled on the 16th. I knew the condition. The major washout would slow my progress, but I should be able to reach the cabin by approximately 1700 to 1730 hours. I departed Collinsworth Gap at 1215 hours. The southwestern section of the trail passed through the rhododendron zones and steeper terrain. My pace was still accelerated. I moved determinedly. My physical condition was fine. My mind was focused on covering distance. At 1435 hours, I reached the major washout location. I worked around it as I had done before. This delay cost me approximately 10 to 15 minutes. By 1640 hours, I had covered the 5.4 miles. I was approaching Grindstone Ridge Cabin from the southeast. The elevation here was approximately 3,200 feet. I could see the cabin through the trees. The structure appeared unoccupied and secure, exactly as I had left it. I unlocked the door at 1645 hours and entered the cabin. Inside the cabin, I took several minutes to assess the space. Everything was exactly as I had left it. The cot was clear. The supplies were undisturbed. The logbook was where I had left it. The kerosene lamp was on the shelf. No indication of any intrusion or disturbance. I opened the logbook and reviewed the entries. My entry from the 15th was present. The date was clearly written. The time was clearly written. I had made note that everything was in proper condition. The entry was in my handwriting. I made a new entry, date April 17th, time 1650 hours. I wrote, "Return to Grindstone Ridge Cabin after completing the northern circuit. Condition, all systems normal, shelter secure, no evidence of intrusion or disturbance. Plan, to depart for Hillman Highway Station tomorrow morning at approximately 0700 hours." I did not mention the sounds from the previous night or the specific acceleration of my travel today. I simply documented my return. I then spent the next several hours preparing the cabin for my departure tomorrow. I cleaned, I organized, I reviewed the supplies to ensure that nothing was missing. I checked the exterior of the building for any signs of damage or concern. Everything was normal. By 1800 hours, I prepared dinner. Rice with canned vegetables. I ate this in the cabin while reviewing my complete route from the previous days. I had covered approximately 18.8 miles over 4 days. My observations included trail conditions, maintenance needs, vegetation status, and weather patterns. This was normal field work. This was exactly what was expected. At 1830 hours, I attempted radio contact with Hillman Highway Station. My transmission went out clearly. I made my daily status report. Location confirmed. Physical condition confirmed. Plan to return to station tomorrow. No problems reported. The response came back clearly. James Garrett confirmed receipt. He mentioned that weather conditions were deteriorating, as expected. He advised me to monitor the weather and to use judgment regarding departure tomorrow. If severe weather developed, I was authorized to remain at the cabin an additional day. All supplies were adequate for extended shelter. I confirmed that I would depart at 0700 hours as planned and that I would attempt radio contact from the Fire Road location if necessary. The conversation ended at 1843 hours. I settled into the cot for the evening. The wind was still substantial outside. The cabin walls creaked slightly with the wind pressure. This is normal. Wood structures move with wind. The creaking was not alarming. I fell asleep at approximately 2000 hours. I woke once during the night at what I estimated to be approximately 0230 hours. The wind was still moving through the area. I heard that rhythmic percussion sound again. The pattern, 1, 2, 3, 4, pause, repeated several times. Then silence. Then no further sound. I lay in the cot and did not leave the cabin. I simply waited. After approximately 10 minutes of silence, I fell back to sleep. I woke at 0515 hours. The wind had diminished somewhat. The darkness was still complete. I rose and prepared morning routine. Coffee, oatmeal, 24 ounces of water. The cabin was warm. My mind was clear and focused. By 0645 hours, I had completed cabin preparation for departure. I made a final logbook entry documenting my departure time and confirming that the shelter was secure and properly prepared. I locked the cabin door at 0650 hours. I began the descent from Grindstone Ridge toward Hillman Highway Station at 0655 hours. The Fire Road descent is steep and requires careful footing. My pack was loaded with the field journals, maps, photographs, and equipment for my patrol circuit. The weight was approximately 30 pounds. My physical condition was excellent. My legs were strong. I had not experienced any significant fatigue despite the accelerated pace of yesterday. By 0900 hours, I had descended approximately 1,1200 feet. I was at the midpoint of the descent. I stopped here to verify my position and to assess my condition. My GPS reading was 38.6912 north, 80.2371 west. This was correct position. Elevation was approximately 2,400 feet. I was approximately halfway to the station. I consumed water and a snack. My physical condition was fine. No pain, no complaints. My mental state was also fine, clear and focused. The concern I had experienced during the night at High Country Camp 1 seemed less significant in the daylight. I resumed movement at 0955 hours. The remainder of the descent took approximately 2 hours. The fire road surface was becoming more settled as I descended from the higher elevations. The erosion issues I had documented on the 15th were still present. I made note of the maintenance items for my report. By 1110 hours, I had reached the Cranberry Run Junction. This is where the fire road transitions to footpath going northward toward Cranberry Valley, but I continued southeastward on the fire road toward the station. This section moves through mixed forest, descending more gradually. The temperature was increasing as elevation decreased. At 12:35 hours, I reached Hillman Highway Ranger Station. I had covered approximately 8.2 miles from Grindstone Ridge Cabin. The descent had taken approximately 5.5 hours. I unlocked the station building and entered. Everything was exactly as I had left it on the morning of April 14th. The logbooks, the equipment inventory, the radio on the shelf, the maps on the wall. No disturbance, no changes. I immediately transmitted a radio message to my supervisor. Status: return to Hillman Highway Station at 12:35 hours. All patrol circuit completed. No emergency situations. Requesting instructions for subsequent assignment. James Garrett responded within 2 minutes. He confirmed my return. He congratulated me on successful completion of the circuit. He instructed me to submit my written report by the end of the week. He advised me to prepare the station for the seasonal closure period. Basic maintenance, supply inventory, securing of equipment. I confirmed receipt of instructions. I signed off at 1:22:45 hours. I spent the remainder of the day organizing my field notes. I transferred information from my notebook to organized documentation files. I compiled my photographs. I created detailed maps showing the maintenance issues I had identified and the locations of trail damage. This work continued until approximately 1700 hours. At 1700 hours, I prepared dinner using station supplies. I had adequate food for 2 days at the station before I would need to arrange for restocking or to return to my regular assignment. Evening arrived. The wind had continued to diminish. By 1900 hours, the weather seemed settled. The low-pressure system had passed through. Clear conditions were returning. I made no attempt to contact the station. There was no scheduled check-in time. I was at the station. There was no need for radio communication. I retired to the sleeping quarters and fell asleep at approximately 20:30 hours. The next morning, April 18th, I woke at 0600 hours. Clear light was coming through the windows. The day appeared fair. Weather conditions seemed to be fully stabilized. No wind, no cloud development. Fair conditions. I spent the morning completing my written report. I documented the complete patrol circuit. I provided detailed descriptions of each major trail section. I noted the maintenance requirements. I included my observations about the Bryce Creek water level and the washout in the Collinsworth Gap approach. I included photographs and detailed maps. I did not include any mention of the sounds I had heard. The voice on the 16th, the fragmented vocalizations on the 16th evening, the rhythmic percussion sounds on the 16th night and again on the 17th night at the cabin. I did not include the observation of the camping evidence at High Country Camp 1. These observations seemed to me, in the daylight and in the clear frame of mind that I now possessed, to be potentially concerning, not because they indicated a real problem, but because they indicated a concern on my part that might be interpreted as anxiety or unfitness for field work. I had been in the field for 4 days. Some auditory experiences in an isolated setting are normal. The camping evidence was simply evidence that other people access this area. There was nothing alarming about any of this. I finished my written report by 1200 hours. I had approximately 15 pages of detailed documentation. I attempted to transmit the written report via email to my supervisor, but the station's internet connection was not operational. This is not unusual. Remote ranger stations often have unreliable internet. I would print the report and provide it directly to my supervisor when I next reported to the main office. I spent the afternoon organizing the station equipment. I inventoried the supplies. I noted what needed to be restocked. I cleaned the equipment. I performed basic maintenance on the radio equipment. This work was routine. By 1700 hours, I had completed all station maintenance work. At 1800 hours, I attempted radio contact with my supervisor. I reported that I had completed the patrol circuit and the written report. I asked about my next assignment. I mentioned that I had planned to remain at the station for one additional day, then return to the main office to deliver the written report and discuss further assignments. James Garrett confirmed. He stated that my next assignment would be determined after I had completed the report submission. He mentioned that there might be additional patrol work in different terrain sections, or there might be office work related to the seasonal maintenance planning. He advised me to be prepared for either possibility. I confirmed that I would be prepared. I signed off at 18:20 hours. The evening passed quietly. I prepared dinner. I read a book I had brought with me. By 20:30 hours, I was in the sleeping quarters and prepared for sleep. I fell asleep at approximately 2100 hours. The morning of April 19th came clear and bright. The weather was excellent. I woke at 0600 hours. The temperature outside was approximately 42 degrees. The forecast called for mild conditions throughout the day. I packed my equipment for the drive back to the main office. The written report was placed carefully in a protective folder. My field notebook was secured. My photographs were organized. By 0900 hours, I had completed all necessary station tasks and had locked the building for the seasonal closure. I drove from Hillman Highway Station toward the main ranger office at approximately 0930 hours. The drive takes approximately 90 minutes under normal conditions. The road was in good condition. The weather remained clear. I arrived at the main office at approximately 1100 hours. My supervisor, James Garrett, was present. I met with him directly. I provided him with the written report. I provided him with the photographs. I provided him with the topographic maps showing maintenance issues. He reviewed the materials while I sat in his office. His expression did not change. He appeared to absorb the information with professional interest. When he had finished reviewing, he looked up at me and asked about my experience during the patrol. I provided him with a verbal summary. The terrain was as expected. The weather was manageable. The trail conditions required maintenance work as documented. The physical demands were appropriate to my fitness level. No emergency situations had developed. The patrol circuit had been completed successfully. He nodded. He asked if there had been any incidents or concerns beyond what was documented. I paused before answering. The rational part of my mind suggested that I should mention the sounds, the evidence of prior camping, the acceleration of my return. But another part suggested that mentioning these concerns might be interpreted as anxiety or unfitness. I had experienced some unusual auditory events, but these were not alarming. They did not represent a genuine problem. I told him that there were no significant incidents beyond what was documented in my report. I mentioned that there was some evidence of prior use at the High Country Camp 1 location and that the trail conditions required attention, as documented. He nodded. He then asked me directly if I had experienced any psychological concerns during the assignment, any anxiety, any difficulties with sleep or mental clarity. I found his question surprising. I told him that I had experienced no psychological concerns. My mental state had remained clear throughout. My sleep had been adequate. My focus had remained professional. He nodded again. He then asked me directly about radio contact during the assignment. I told him that radio contact had been variable. The first evening at Grindstone Ridge Cabin had produced no response. The second evening at Collinsworth Gap Shelter had produced degraded signal quality. The third evening at High Country Camp 1 had produced good signal quality. The pattern was consistent with known radio propagation issues in mountain terrain. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked me if I had noticed anything unusual about the radio communications specifically. I asked what he meant. He said, "When we communicated on the evening of the 16th, did you notice anything unusual about my voice or the quality of the transmission beyond the static?" I considered this carefully. I remembered the radio check-in on the evening of the 16th. I had expected James Garrett's voice on the other end. I had received a response, but the quality had been poor. I had understood perhaps 60% of the words, but the voice that came back had sounded. I was uncertain. It had sounded like it could have been James Garrett, but I was not absolutely certain. The distortion created by the static had made positive identification difficult. I told him that I had assumed the voice was his because I expected his voice on the other end of that frequency at that time. The static had distorted the signal enough that I could not be completely certain of identification. He was quiet for a longer period. Then he said, "I want to tell you something about that evening. About the 16th. I waited." He said, "I attempted to contact you on the evening of the 16th. I transmitted at the scheduled time. I attempted to reach you for approximately 4 minutes. I received no response. The frequency remained open, but there was no reply. Nothing. I eventually stopped attempting and made a notation that I was unable to establish contact on that date. I felt something shift in my mental state. Not dramatic, not panic, but a distinct shift. A displacement of what I had understood to be accurate." I told him that I had definitely received a radio transmission that evening. I had heard his voice, though distorted. I was certain of this. He nodded. He said, "I know, and that's what troubles me, because the station logs show that I did not transmit on that evening. My equipment was operational. My attempted transmission at that time produced no signal, no carrier, nothing. The equipment functioned normally the previous evening and the subsequent evening. But on the 16th something was wrong. I could not establish a signal. I found myself without a clear response." He continued, "The frequency was definitely open. I was speaking into the microphone. The equipment indicated transmission, but you heard my voice on the receiving end, and I did not transmit. That is not possible, Marcus. That is not possible according to radio physics and equipment function." I remained silent. He said, "I want you to think carefully about what you experienced during that assignment. I want you to report to the district medical officer for a complete physical and psychological evaluation. I am not implying that you are unfit for duty, but something unusual appears to have happened, and I want to make sure that you receive appropriate evaluation." I asked him directly if he was suggesting that I had experienced some kind of hallucination. He said, "I am not suggesting anything specific. I am suggesting that you should receive a professional evaluation. That is all." I agreed to contact the district medical officer and to schedule the evaluation. The meeting ended at approximately 11:45 hours. The medical evaluation occurred on April 22nd. The physician, Dr. Jennifer Howell, conducted a complete physical examination. My vital signs were normal, my reflexes were normal, my physical fitness was excellent, no health concerns were identified. She then conducted a psychological evaluation, questions about my mental health history, my sleep quality, my stress levels, my experience in the field, my relationships with colleagues, my overall sense of well-being. I answered all questions honestly. I mentioned the auditory experiences during the patrol assignment. I described the sounds I had heard. I provided as much detail as I could about the quality and character of the sounds. Dr. Howell asked me to describe my emotional reaction to these sounds. I told her that my initial reaction had been surprise. The sounds were unexpected, but I had rationalized them as natural forest sounds or as auditory illusions created by isolation and exhaustion. She asked me if I had experienced fear. I told her that at High Country Camp 1, when I had heard the rhythmic percussion pattern, I had experienced a sense of unease, but not significant fear, not panic. She asked me if I had ever experienced auditory hallucinations previously. I told her that I had not. She made notes. She then asked me about my relationship with my supervisor and my confidence in his abilities and honesty. I told her that I trusted James Garrett completely. He was a skilled professional and a reliable person. She asked me if I considered it possible that my supervisor might have made an error regarding the radio transmission. I told her that I did not know. Equipment can malfunction. Records can be incomplete. But I also trusted what he had told me about his experience. The evaluation concluded at approximately 1200 hours. Dr. Howell said that she would provide her findings to my supervisor within 1 week. She told me that based on her evaluation, she could find no evidence of psychological impairment or mental illness. My responses were appropriate and consistent. My memory of events was clear. My thought processes were rational. However, she said that she recommended a period of light-duty assignment, away from isolated field work, for a period of 4 to 6 weeks. After that period, she recommended reassessment before returning to extended backcountry patrol work. I agreed to this recommendation. The weeks following my assignment to the Monongahela sector were quiet. I was assigned to office work at the ranger station. I assisted with equipment maintenance, file organization, and administrative tasks. The work was routine and well-structured, no significant challenges. I maintained contact with James Garrett. Our conversations were brief and professional. He did not ask me directly about the evaluation results, though I assumed he had received Dr. Howell's report. On May 10th, approximately 3 weeks after my evaluation, I requested a meeting with James Garrett to discuss my reassignment. He agreed. We met in his office at approximately 1400 hours. I told him that I felt ready to return to field work, that the light duty period had been productive, that I had reflected carefully on my experience during the Monongahela assignment, that I was prepared to conduct another assignment if he deemed it appropriate. He reviewed some paperwork on his desk. Then he said, "Before we discuss reassignment, I want to ask you some questions about your radio communication, specifically the transmission you received on the evening of the 16th. I nodded. He asked me to describe exactly what I heard, the quality, the specific words, everything I could remember. I told him that I remembered hearing him confirm my status. I remembered him asking about my condition. I remembered him mentioning that conditions looked uncertain. I remembered him confirming our conversation conclusion. He said, "You remember me saying that conditions look uncertain?" I told him yes. Those were the words I heard. He opened a drawer in his desk and removed a file. He opened the file and showed me several pages. He explained that these were communications logs and records from the radio station at Brickhouse Ridge Tower. These are the central receiving and broadcasting point for all ranger communications in the region, he said. According to these logs, I made 0 radio transmissions on April 16th. No attempt, no signal, no record whatsoever. The logs show my transmission on April 15th, then nothing until April 17th. He paused. He then said, "But the Brickhouse Ridge Tower did receive a transmission on April 16th at approximately 1750 hours, a transmission on the Ranger frequencies. The source was unidentified. The tower operator attempted to respond but received no further transmission. The source was not identified as any known Ranger radio." I found myself struggling to construct a rational response to this information. He continued. The content of that transmission included voice communication, fragments of words. The quality was degraded. The tower operator assumed it was a hiker or unauthorized person using the frequencies. These events do occur occasionally. The event was logged, but no follow-up investigation was pursued. He removed another page from the file. He said, "This is a copy of the tower operator's log entry for that date." I read the entry. The date was April 16th. The time was 1752 hours. The entry stated, "Received unidentified transmission on Ranger frequency 162.35 MHz. Source unknown. Multiple attempts to make contact resulted in no response. Content was voice communication, but quality was severely degraded. Possibly unauthorized user. Possibly equipment malfunction. Not identified as Ranger unit. No follow-up initiated." I looked up from the page. James Garrett said, "You heard that transmission, that unidentified transmission. You heard it while you were at Collinsworth Gap, while you believed you were in contact with me." I attempted to process this. He said, "I have the recording of that transmission. The tower operator records all unidentified activity. I have listened to the recording myself. The voice is unusual. The quality is degraded, as noted. But there are moments where it sounds almost like my voice. There are moments where it sounds like it could be someone imitating my voice. And there are moments where it sounds like something else entirely." He did not provide me with the recording to listen to. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you believe that you could have imagined my voice? That you could have created the sound that you expected to hear because you expected to hear it?" I thought about this carefully. I told him that I did not believe so. I heard a distinct voice, a transmission, a response to my own transmission. He said, "I believe you. I believe that you heard something. But I do not know what you heard, and I am concerned about what that means." My reassignment came through on May 20th. I was assigned to a different sector, the Shenandoah region, eastern sections, well-traveled areas with frequent day hiker traffic and established ranger presence, no extended backcountry work, no isolated assignments, consistent radio coverage, collaborative team environment. The assignment is substantially less interesting than the Monongahela work, but I do not experience the same sense of isolation. There are other rangers, there are frequent visitors, there is established infrastructure and communication systems. I have worked in this assignment for 7 weeks now. My mental state is stable. My work performance is satisfactory. No incidents, no concerns raised by my supervisors, but I have not returned to the Monongahela sector. I have not conducted any backcountry patrol work that extends beyond established day hiker trails. When work in remote areas is required, I request assignment of a partner ranger. This is not standard protocol for ranger work, but my supervisors have accommodated my requests without question. I have thought extensively about what occurred during the Monongahela assignment. I have considered multiple explanations. I have reviewed the information I gathered. I have reflected on my own mental state and my responses to unusual circumstances. I do not know what the voice was. I do not know what the sounds were that I heard during the nights at the cabin and at High Country Camp 1. I do not know why another ranger's voice seemed to broadcast from an unidentified source on frequencies I was monitoring. I do not know why my supervisor's radio equipment would not function on one specific evening but functioned normally on surrounding evenings. The rational explanations do not fully resolve these questions. Equipment could malfunction. Auditory illusions are possible. Radio waves are subject to unusual propagation in certain circumstances, but none of these explanations fully account for the specific pattern of events. The observations of other people at the High Country Camp location remain unexplained. The specific percussion pattern of the sounds I heard remain unexplained. The gap in radio communications remain unexplained. I have reviewed the tower operator's recording once. James Garrett provided me access to it approximately 2 months after my assignment. I listened to it with professional interest and detachment. The voice quality is indeed degraded, as described. There are moments where it sounds familiar. There are moments where it sounds entirely alien. There are moments where it sounds like something attempting to mimic human speech without fully understanding the process. But I can hear only fragments. I can hear only pieces of vocalization. I cannot assemble the pieces into coherent meaning or clear identification. I remain assigned to the Shenandoah sector. I remain in contact with my supervisor and my colleagues. I remain professionally competent and reliable in my duties, but I have not returned to the Monongahela sector. I have not attempted to explain to my supervisors what occurred. I have not pursued any investigation into the unusual events. I continue to work. I continue to perform my responsibilities. I continue to maintain my professional presentation. I sleep adequately. I eat adequately. I function at an appropriate level, but I remain uncertain about what I experienced during those 4 days in April. And I have become aware, gradually and without dramatic change, that I doubt my own perception in ways that I did not doubt before. I second-guess memories that I previously considered clear. I question sensory input that I would have previously accepted without consideration. I experience moments of disorientation regarding orientation, time progression, and distance calculation. These are subtle effects. They do not interfere with my work. They do not create obvious symptoms, but they are present. I have not mentioned these effects to Dr. Howell or to any other medical professional. I have not mentioned them to James Garrett or to any supervisor. I simply continue my work and accept that something occurred during that assignment that I do not fully understand. I have received word that a new ranger will be assigned to the Monongahela sector beginning in September. The position will rotate yearly, with rangers spending a season in that area for extended backcountry patrol work. I do not plan to request that position. If asked directly whether I would recommend the position to other rangers, I would likely provide a neutral response. The terrain is challenging but manageable. The assignment is interesting and provides opportunity for meaningful field work, but I would likely also find reasons to suggest that the assignment might be better suited to a ranger without significant backcountry experience. A ranger who would find the new challenges compelling and engaging. I would not explain why. I would simply make my recommendation and move forward. This is what I have become, I think. This is what the assignment has created in me. Not trauma, but uncertainty. Not fear, but doubt. I remain vigilant in the field. I remain careful with my equipment. I remain professional in my communications and documentation, but I no longer fully trust the reliability of what I perceive. And that distrust is something I carry with me constantly now. It is always present in the background. It colors my decisions. It influences my behavior. It makes me avoid situations that might recreate the conditions of that April assignment. The official report remains filed in the district office. My documentation of the patrol assignment, the maintenance needs, the weather observations, the trail conditions, no mention of the voice, no mention of the sounds, no mention of the camping evidence at High Country Camp 1, simply a professional record of a completed assignment. But I know what I heard, and I know what I do not understand, and that gap between what I experienced and what I can explain remains unresolved. It may always remain unresolved. I am aware now, in a way that I was not aware before, that the Appalachian forests contain something that my understanding cannot fully articulate. That the isolation creates conditions where perception becomes unreliable. That the boundaries between what is real and what is imagined become unclear. I continue my work. I do not return to the high country. I do not speak of what I experienced, and I remain uncertain, in ways that I did not know it was possible to remain uncertain, about whether that silence constitutes wisdom or simply fear.